Everybody's getting ready. You ready?
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody. This hearing will come to order. The hearing today will focus on the cost and consequences of the Biden-Harris energy agenda. I'd like to welcome our panel of expert witnesses, starting with Ms. Diana Fercott Roth, who is the Director of the Center for Energy, Climate, and Environment at the Heritage Foundation. Then Mr. Alex Epstein, President and founder of the Center for Industrial Progress. Ms. Donna Jackson, the Director of Membership Development at Project 21, and we'll find out a little bit more about that, I'm sure, in your testimony. And Mr. Trevor Higgins, Senior Vice President of Energy and Environment at the Center for American Progress. So welcome to our witnesses. Thank you for your time and your insights on behalf of my colleagues on the Budget Committee. Okay, I'm going to yield myself such time as I may consume for an opening statement. I'm going to allow my ranking member and friend, Brendan Boyle, to make his opening statement, and then I'm going to go down the line with our witnesses for their opening statements. Our hearing today, as I mentioned, focuses on the fiscal cost and economic consequences of the Biden-Harris administration's failed economic and mainly energy policies. That's the focus. Those costs have been significant and measurable, and the consequences have been manifold and dire. The whole of government regulatory attack on conventional fuels, the increased taxes on oil and gas, and massive market distorting green energy subsidies have choked the lifeblood of this economy, the greatest in the world. It's also crushed our working families with a cost of living crisis, and it has compromised our national security by making the United States more reliant on foreign adversaries. The Biden-Harris administration has issued 250 executive actions against one industry, an industry that employs 10 million people with high-wage jobs, represents almost 10% of our total economy, and has had, no doubt, a positive impact on every facet of our daily lives by producing the most reliable, affordable, and abundant source of energy. As a result of our God-given blessed resources and the most innovative and efficient energy industry operators, we have the strongest and most dynamic economy in the world. It's why we have the greatest fighting force in the world. And it's why we are the world's superpower. But today, the failed energy policies driven by what I believe is an extreme climate agenda has undermined all of the above. It's resulted in higher gas prices at the pump, as high as $5, over $5, the highest we've ever seen and experienced in this country. On average, it's been $1 more per gallon in cost than the previous administration. The cost of electricity has gone up, now 25 to 30% for families. The total consumption cost for our average income families is almost twice what it was in the previous administration. Policies have consequences, and that consequence for families is a whopping $1,700 per family per year. These costs on the economy and on our consumers, the American people, are a direct result of the policies of the Biden-Harris administration. On his first day in office, President Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, which would have saved us in transportation costs and safety $50 billion. But it didn't stop there. It was all critical infrastructure in the links of the supply chain, from export terminals to permitting refineries and other pipelines. Biden-Harris's moratorium on drilling on public lands will cost $33 billion in lost GDP and roughly 60,000 jobs. There have been overreaching and overburdensome emission regulations coming out of the EPA. Think about the methane gas rule. We've seen a 66% reduction by the industry over the last several years in methane gas emissions, but there are layer upon layers of these burdensome and I believe unnecessary regulations that the cost of which are passed on to consumers. The EV mandate alone, the tailpipe emissions, $870 billion over roughly 20 years. They've depleted, this administration, our strategic petroleum reserves to smooth off the edge of the spike in prices, and we're now down with a strategic petroleum reserve of a 40-year low. On the subsidy side, $800 billion in tax subsidies for green energy corporations, and some studies say that 70% of that value will be accrued to China because of their rare earth mineral mining and component parts to the renewable energy industry. The EV tax credit is, in many ways, going to the upper middle and upper income individuals. And I want to dig into that with you, Ms. Jackson, and the impact on middle-class families and our minority communities here in the United States. Look, the fiscal health of our country is in decline. I think we all agree with that. You can't look at the balance sheet. You can't look at CBO's projections. You can't look at the debt to GDP, which is higher than it's been since World War II and more relative peace and prosperity, and not be concerned. We have to rein in spending and we have to grow this economy. We have to have policies that encourage and foster growth. And central to that are good energy policies. If we can grow 1%, we can save $3 trillion to put against the deficit. If we grow 1%, we can add $10,000 over 10 years in hardworking Americans' pocketbooks, and we can bring the debt to GDP, the indebtedness of our country, down by at least 20 percentage points. So growth is key, and the lifeblood for that growth is energy and good energy policies. And I think we've seen the opposite of it, disastrous energy policies, disastrous results, and we have to make a change if we're going to get our country on a good fiscal path and hand it to our children in a manner that gives them the opportunities and prosperity that we've all enjoyed. With that, I yield to my ranking member as much time as he may consume for his opening remark.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, before I give remarks in response on the topic of our hearing today, I will note that we are now 11 days away, 11 days and perhaps 14 hours from what would be a government shutdown without a continuing resolution passing the House and passing the Senate. It is unfortunate that the Speaker and his leadership team have been spinning their wheels and wasting all of our time on a Republican-only approach, which failed miserably on the House floor last night. I again urge the Speaker and his leadership team to work with Democrats, both in the House and the Senate, so that we can avoid a costly and completely unnecessary government shutdown, and we can do the work of the American people. 11 days is not much time, and the sooner the Speaker and Republican leadership realize that this highly partisan, go-it-alone approach is failing, as we saw last night, and doomed to fail, the sooner they recognize that, the sooner we can get out of this mess and assure that we avoid a costly government shutdown. Now, on the topic at hand of the hearing, I appreciate the opportunity to have a hearing to celebrate the many successes of this administration when it comes to energy. Here is a fact. Under the Biden-Harris administration, our total energy production is now at an all-time high, exceeding domestic consumption by a record amount. This may be an inconvenient fact for some, but under President Biden and Vice President Harris, we are now producing more oil than ever before, more than Russia, more than Saudi Arabia, and more than any other country on earth. In my home state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we've produced more natural gas over the last 3 years than any time before it. The reality is, under President Biden and Vice President Harris, the United States is achieving energy independence. Specifically on the price of gas, I just checked this morning, wanted to make sure I had up-to-date figures. Prices at the pump are now averaging $3.22 a gallon. That's the national average. That is almost 70 cents below where it was a year ago. In real dollars, that is actually far below where we were about 15, 16 years ago during the tail end of the Bush administration. I would also point out that the price of oil obviously surged after Vladimir Putin's unjustified and illegal invasion of Ukraine. But because of actions this administration has taken, as well as our European allies, I'm proud to say a barrel of oil today costs roughly 1/2 of what it did following Putin's invasion. So this is a record that we can celebrate. I appreciate the words of the Fed chair yesterday when making the announcement that we are at the 2% target and therefore can begin lowering interest rates. No wonder that just this morning, literally as I speak, the stock market, the Dow and the S&P are literally at all-time highs. The reality is clear. The United States has bounced back from the worldwide pandemic better, stronger, and more secure than any other country on earth. Now, when we look at that record of success, we need to recognize it is under threat. Donald Trump's Project 2025 would turn back the clock on all of this progress. Trump reportedly asked Big Oil for $1 billion in campaign contributions, and his Project 2025 makes it perfectly clear what they would be getting in return. Their extreme plans would destroy the Inflation Reduction Act, and along with it, they would threaten the 300,000 new jobs that we have delivered in clean energy as part of a generational transition. They would rip away the tax credits that are saving families money on their energy bills right now. They would gut the EPA and force out our children to drink dirtier water and breathe more polluted air. Even as they would force family to pay higher costs, Trump's plans would cut taxes for the biggest corporations in America, delivering a $1.3 billion tax break to just the 5 largest oil companies in America. American families cannot afford this dangerous agenda. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again and look forward to listening to our witnesses as well as our colleagues, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania, my ranking member, and would now turn our attention to our witnesses. I want to thank them for being here. Again, their time. The committee's received your written statements. They will be made part of the record of the formal hearing. You will each be given 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks. Ms. Fercott Roth, you will begin, if you would begin your 5 minutes.
Harrington, Ranking Member Boyle, members of the committee, I'm honored to be invited to testify before you today, and the views that I express are my own. So the question before us today is, do subsidies and incentives for renewables and electric vehicles and regulations curtailing production of domestic oil and natural gas, as well as curtailing the sale of gasoline-powered vehicles and stoves, gas stoves, do they increase the price of electricity and transportation? And does greater use of renewables and electric vehicles help the climate? Having renewables and electric vehicles raises the cost of electricity, food, and transportation without benefit to the climate. The residential cost of electricity has risen by 32% since January 2021, and the price of gasoline has also risen. These costs are falling disproportionately on the poor, who pay a higher share of their income in food and energy costs. Costs fall on small business and farmers who rely on transportation and electricity for their livelihoods. Take a look at this chart here. This ranks states in terms of cost of electricity from most expensive to least expensive. So here we have the state rank. Here we have the names of the states. Here we have the residential electricity costs. Here we have a check if it's a Democrat governor, a check if it's a Democrat legislature, and here a check if it's part of a regional transmission organization. And this column here is renewable portfolio standard, which is the share of electricity required to be produced by renewables by 2035. So we see that the 10 most expensive states are Democrat-controlled, except for Alaska. And Alaska is not part of the lower 48, so it has connection problems of its own. And these all mandate renewables. Then the 10 least expensive states down here are all, for electricity, are all Republican, with the exception of one, Washington State, and they don't mandate renewables. Washington State benefits from vast amounts of hydropower, which is very inexpensive. So what we see is that most states that don't have renewables, don't require renewables, have residential electricity rates of 15 cents per kilowatt hour or lower. States that do require renewables, such as California, New York, Michigan, New Jersey, they have rates that are 15 cents, above 15 cents. California's is 33 cents per kilowatt hour. Texas and Florida are about 14 cents an hour. But what the Inflation Reduction Act does is give credits and tax incentives worth about $1 trillion to companies to make these renewables, batteries, and EVs, and to people who buy them. And so the Inflation Reduction Act is making electricity more expensive. The Biden-Harris administration has put out rules that penalize car manufacturers if 70% of their sales are not electric by 2032, in contrast to 7% today. EPA has also ruled that if power plants don't sequester or bury 95% of their carbon emissions by 2032, they have to close down in 2040. And the technology isn't available now. So the Biden-Harris rules, if not repealed, would sow a perfect storm of future problems. Imagine it's 2032. You've spent an extra $26,000 on a Ford electric Lightning pickup truck because you can't buy a gasoline-powered Ford F-150. And your electricity bill goes through the roof because power plants are closing down all over the country. EPA wrote that it expected coal-fired power plants to close down. That's 16% of US electricity production. The Biden-Harris administration has promised to reduce US greenhouse gas emissions to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. Dr. Kevin Dyaratna, chief statistician at the Heritage Foundation, estimated that the economy would lose more than $7.7 trillion in GDP through 2040 if these goals were achieved. His research shows that even completely eliminating fossil fuels from the United States would only make a difference of 0.2 degrees centigrade, and this comes from government models. Even the Defense Department, whose mission is to defend the United States, is being asked to use biofuels to make its military vehicles and jets more climate friendly, and is planning on 170,000 electric vehicles. Green policies will make America dependent on China, which makes the largest share of renewables and EVs, and harm American energy, economic, and national security. Thanks very much.
I thank the gentlelady and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Alex Epstein.
Thank you. My name is Alex Epstein. I'm a nonpartisan philosopher and energy expert. I'm very grateful today to share with members of both parties my analysis of what I call government-dictated green energy, which is the essential energy policy of the Biden-Harris administration and of much of today's world. The basic idea of government-dictated green energy is that the government should force us to rapidly reduce our use of fossil fuel energy and replace it with so-called green energy, mostly solar and wind, such that we reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 at the latest. There are 3 basic truths you need to know about the costs of government-dictated green energy, and I think these are really underappreciated even by critics. So one is they have been enormous so far. 2 is they would have been catastrophic had it not been for the resistance of their opponents. This is very important when you hear Biden administration has record production. That's in spite of them, not because of them. And 3, they will be apocalyptic if not stopped in the future. So let's talk about the costs so far of government-dictated green energy. All the energy-related problems we have experienced in recent years, which have been a lot, so high gasoline prices, higher heating bills, higher electricity bills, and unreliable electricity, which is a huge problem we need to talk much more about, are the result of government-dictated green energy. And it's very simple. When you shackle the most cost-effective and scalable source of energy, fossil fuels, and you subsidize unreliable solar and wind that wouldn't otherwise be competitive, energy necessarily becomes more expensive, less reliable, and less secure. So again, it's very simple. Unfortunately, the current administration and many others are engaged in a denial campaign, blaming our energy problems on everything but their own policies. And then their main targets for blame are Putin, which is a factor, but a derivative factor, and then industry greed, which is a lot. So high fossil fuel prices are not a Putin price hike. They're caused fundamentally by government-dictated green energy. So what happened is they made fossil fuel prices artificially high before Putin's war, and they made our capacity much less than it should have been. So they prevented the free world from quickly increasing production like it could have if we had actually had what I call energy freedom. And high fossil fuel prices have certainly not been determined by greed, including so-called price gouging, which is a big focus right now. Prices are determined by supply and demand. If oil and gas companies could control energy prices in their favor, why didn't they do this from 2015 to 2020 when they were losing money? So the truth is that government-dictated green energy policies are fundamentally responsible for all the energy-related costs we experience today compared to a decade ago. And in fact, it's worse than that. There's an opportunity cost. Because were it not for these policies, energy would have gotten considerably cheaper and more reliable, especially with lower natural gas prices, which should have lowered electricity prices. Instead, they've gone up because we've added a bunch of wasteful and unreliable stuff. And it gets worse. Since energy is the industry that powers every other industry, by making energy more expensive and less reliable, we make everything more expensive and less reliable, which means government-dictated green energy drives price inflation. Very important point. But even blaming Biden-Harris's government-dictated green energy policies and those of other countries for all the energy-related costs we experience today, including inflation, is not enough, because we have to recognize that these policies would have done far more damage had they not been vigorously opposed. In action after action, unfortunately, the Biden administration has shown us that it will do anything it can get away with politically to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels. So pipeline blocking, federal leasing bans, LNG prohibitions, power plant shutdowns, EV mandates, SEC rules, et cetera. Now, most of what this administration has tried to do to rapidly eliminate fossil fuel use has thankfully been slowed by opposition. So congressional battles, lawsuits over power plant shutdowns, courts reversing illegal leasing bans, et cetera. But without this opposition, they would have already caused energy ruin. And consider a failing grid. So we desperately need more reliable power plants, given huge demand from AI and EVs, which that's artificial demand mostly from the administration. But our EPA has tried to shut down all coal, which is 1/6 of reliable capacity. Were it not for the opponents of this administration's government-dictated green energy policies, we'd already have a third world grid. So you have to think about the real cost if they had gotten their way. So I hope you can understand why I'm so concerned about our energy future. The costs of government-dictated green energy have been enormous and would have been truly catastrophic had this administration done everything it wanted to. Here's what scares me most. Our administration and others promised to rapidly eliminate fossil fuel use to reach net zero by 2050. But so far, they've only managed to slow fossil fuels' growth. They haven't reduced it, they've just slowed its growth. And that has caused an energy crisis. So what happens if we really start going net zero, which is the promise ahead of us? Just think about agriculture. Our ability to feed 8 billion people is dependent on natural gas for fertilizer and diesel for farm equipment, neither of which has a near-term scalable substitute that's not fossil fuel. Government-dictated green energy unopposed would starve much of the world. And I'll just say as I conclude, there is an alternative to government-dictated green energy, energy freedom, which means the freedom to produce and use all sources of energy, so long as they are subject to reasonable protections against pollution and other form of endangerment. And that's really going to be the key to having energy abundance and resilience to climate in the near future, and energy innovation, including among alternatives, long-term. So whatever party you're from, again, I don't affiliate with either party. I want to help you fight for energy freedom, and I welcome your questions.
I thank Mr. Epstein for his remarks, and now yield to Ms. Jackson 5 minutes.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, members of this committee, I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this important topic today. My name is Donna Jackson, and I'm the Director of Membership Development for Project 21 Black Leadership Network. We cover a wide range of issues, but our fundamental focus is lifting people out of poverty and government dependence into prosperity and self-sufficiency. Green New Deal style policies like those in the Inflation Reduction Act cost Americans twice. First, we pay billions and quite possibly trillions in tax dollars to subsidize these alternative green sources and technologies. And since green energy usually costs more, we end up with higher utility bills as well as rising prices from everything from housing to cars to food. At the same time, this agenda prevents us from getting the full benefits of the abundance of fossil fuels this nation is blessed with. Overall, green policies are a bad deal for the American people, but it is low-income households that suffer the most when energy affordability is no longer the priority. Of course, we'll hear a lot of hype about the disproportionate impacts of environmental threats and especially climate change from activists, but the reality is, for millions of struggling households, it is the disproportionate impact of environmental policy that's the real problem. I'll start with the issue of housing affordability. Home ownership is absolutely critical to breaking the cycle of poverty and creating intergenerational wealth for low-income and minority families. A recent study finds that homeowners have 40 times the net worth of renters, yet costly environmental policies are practically tailor-made to place the goal of home ownership further out of reach at a time when prices are at a record high and so are interest rates. Most recently, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, who's tasked with helping first-time buyers and low-income buyers with mortgages, adopted new green building code requirements that would cost up to $31,000 per household, would add additional costs. At the same time, the Department of Energy and the EPA are imposing new regulations raising the cost of nearly every appliance that goes into a home. We heard a lot about government efforts to go after stoves, but there are also regulations regarding the most expensive appliances, including furnaces, air conditioners, and water heaters. And just as important as home ownership is to low-income and minority families, so is vehicle ownership. And I'm gonna tell you, on this point, the EV agenda is absolutely no friend to the working class. Affordable cars, and let's be honest, gas-powered cars are critical to climbing up the economic ladder. Being able to drive to work opens up many opportunities than being limited to only jobs accessible to public transportation. And there's countless studies that show that people that live in low-income families have to drive further to find the best economic opportunities for them to sustain their families. And in addition, having a car allows low-income families to participate in the gig market when today, in today's economy, they have to have 2 and 3 jobs to be able to sustain any kind of dignity. And even beyond jobs and economic development, cars are also indispensable for raising a family. As a single mom who raised 5 kids, 5, don't tell me that I could have done that relying on public transportation. EVs can't take the place of gas-powered cars. They have higher sticker price, limited range, the options for charging for urban people living in urban communities are limited, and it's even a question that if people getting government assistance can even own an asset that valuable. I would like to conclude by discussing the ongoing problem of energy poverty. There are various definitions of energy poverty and energy insecurity, but it all boils down to this: households are having to cut back on necessities in order to pay their energy bills. Studies show that 25% of households have to forego food and medicine to pay their energy bills, and that's substantially higher for low-income and minority families. It's mind-boggling in this country. The solution to energy poverty and to The key to restoring the American dream for households struggling to achieve it is not subsidies and mandates for solar panels, EVs, and wind turbines. It is the abundant, reliable, and affordable supply of coal, oil, and natural gas right beneath our feet. And the nearly 2 million well-paying blue-collar gateway jobs the industry provides that mostly minorities take advantage of. And unlike green energy, which only succeeds when the government spends taxpayers' dollars tilting the playing field in its favor, the only thing the federal government needs to do to ensure real energy abundance and affordability is stay out of the way. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady, and now defer to Mr. Higgins for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Arrington. Thank you, Ranking Member Boyle and members of the committee. My name is Trevor Higgins, and I lead the Energy and Environment Department at the Center for American Progress. And I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony on the progress of clean and affordable energy investments, roughly 2 years now into the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. Since its enactment in August 2022, overall inflation has slowed 70%. Grocery price inflation has slowed by 93%. Energy price inflation has not only slowed, but fully reversed and dropped by more than 7%. Meanwhile, wages have risen by more than 8%, far outpacing inflation. Total employment has grown nearly 4%, and economic output is up 10%. This is an exceptionally strong record. The Inflation Reduction Act is living up to its name. Today, I will highlight a few of the ways that the law's strategic investments are driving economic growth, creating new opportunities for the middle class, and lowering energy costs. I'll also highlight the consequences of repeal. First, in the last 2 years, according to the Clean Investment Monitor maintained by the Rhodium Group and MIT, total U.S. investment in domestic clean energy manufacturing has quadrupled. These investments are preparing the U.S. to remain competitive in the global clean energy economy. Second, clean electricity has become the most affordable source of energy there is, and these investments in the clean energy economy are getting it built. As a recent report from Energy Innovation has documented, states that are investing in clean electricity have seen less increase in electricity prices than states who have remained most dependent on natural gas. In Texas, for example, wind and solar have saved $11 billion in wholesale electricity costs in 2022 alone. Third, clean energy investments in creating new, good-paying jobs already have led to the announcement of more than 330,000 new jobs. Fourth, these new investment programs are directly supporting families and communities who want to switch to electricity and reduce their energy costs. Grants, loans, green banks, and direct pay tax credits are making it possible for local libraries to add rooftop solar, for small businesses to fix up the energy efficiency of their storefronts, for school districts to buy pollution-free school buses, and for retrofitting affordable housing apartments with up-to-date equipment. And even households who are not ready to make the switch to electricity will still see major savings from the economy-wide transition to clean energy. Unless the excess demand is exported overseas, declining demand for fossil fuels generally translates into lower prices for domestic manufacturers and households. The overall effect of these policies is to shift the economy towards clean and affordable energy. And under current policy, household energy costs are on course to drop by 1/3 in 2035. That's an annual savings of roughly $2,000 per household. Clean Air Act pollution standards, energy efficiency regulations, clean energy investments, these are unmistakably powerful tools in the fight against inflation. Unfortunately, there are detailed plans and ongoing efforts to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, which would have severe consequences for the U.S. economy, imperiling the domestic energy manufacturing renaissance and raising costs for working Americans. Project 2025 and the Republican Study Committee's budget for fiscal year 2025 both call for repealing the Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy tax incentives. And according to modeling from Energy Innovation, Project 2025's plans for climate and energy would cause 750,000 direct job losses in 2030, would decrease annual GDP by over $300 billion. These plans would raise electricity prices, prolong gasoline dependence, reversing the trajectory towards lower clean energy costs that I talked about, and instead increasing annual household energy spending above even pre-Inflation Reduction Act levels. Worse, Project 2025's plans would lock the United States into continued greenhouse gas emissions of more than 4.7 gigatons every year from now through 2050 and beyond, which would make it nearly impossible to slow the pace of global warming. Among the many disastrous and irreversible consequences, I'll highlight, given the topic of this hearing, that climate change also raises costs. Weather and climate disasters are on the rise. There have been $28 billion disasters last year. That is amounted to more than $90 billion in costs. Already at current levels of warming, insurance premiums have increased 33% between 2020 and 2023. Extreme heat costs $1 billion in extra healthcare costs in the United States every summer. Fighting climate change fights inflation. From rising disruptions of climate change to the volatility of fossil fuel prices, from the global competitiveness of the US economy to the earning power of workers' wages, the many complicated challenges of the costs of energy are all made easier to resolve by investment in clean energy. I'm grateful to the members of the 117th Congress whose leadership in enacting the Inflation Reduction Act has so successfully channeled our country's limitless industry into raising wages, lowering prices, and fighting climate change. Thank you.
I thank you, Mr. Higgins, for your remarks, and we'll now move to the Q&A portion of our hearing. I'm going to yield myself 5 minutes. Ms. Jackson, you've been an advocate, a strong voice for working families and middle-class folk. Listening to Mr. Higgins say that the Inflation Reduction Act has done its job, which suggests that inflation has been reduced and the lives of Americans are better today than they were prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, the spending, the taxes, the regulations, and this energy policy of the Biden-Harris administration. I assume you engage and listen to middle class and working families. Do you think they would agree with Mr. Higgins? What do you think their response would be to listen to his statement, it's done its job, and my colleague and friend's statement that we should celebrate this record of energy success?
None of the people that I talk to are celebrating. In fact, I can tell you right now that most of the people that I talk to are not even living paycheck to paycheck. They're living paycheck to Wednesday, and they have to borrow, and they're already underwater before they can even get to the next week. I talked to a mother this week who said to me she has to work a full-time job, pick up her kids, then put them in a car, drive around for another 6 and 8 hours with small kids under the age of 5 because she cannot afford the standard of living that she had before all of these green new policies were pushed on them. She barely gets 3 hours of sleep, and this is not an unusual statement. Everybody is feeling the burden of high energy prices, high food costs. Nobody feels like they're getting ahead. Everybody has depleted their savings, they're underwater in debt from credit cards, and they still feel like nobody's listening to them. My think tank is a conservative think tank, but 90% of the phone calls I get are from liberals asking me for help because they're hurting. And it seems like no policy is great enough in terms of saving the planet that doesn't hurt working class families. So all of the burden is being carried by low income and middle class families.
Sounds like a disconnect to me from what I'm hearing from some of my colleagues
It's not
and the
that
reality
it's
on the
out
ground.
of the planet.
Let me move to Mr. Epstein because this is a sincere issue that I've mulled over ever since I read the Green New Deal plan and what I believe is a very extreme response to a very modest change in the climate in terms of temperature. The premise, it seems like, from my colleagues is as follows. Climate change is significant. The consequences are catastrophic and in the near term, and we need massive government intervention or we're going to destroy the planet. Therefore, it is the greatest existential crisis. Never once in my entire career at a town hall anywhere has anybody raised the issue of the threat of climate. They've raised a lot of threats, a lot of them that Ms. Jackson mentioned, like this inflation tax that is regressive and hurting working people more than any single issue. They can't even think beyond that because they're trying to survive, which is why we have the highest consumer debt in history, the highest credit card debt in history. It's real. The facts support that. Is this the right way to, is that premise accurate? Is that the right way to frame this? Because they may argue, yes, it's painful, yes, prices are going up, but we're saving the planet, and we're saving America from this existential threat. What do you say, Mr. Edson?
So I hope I get asked more about this because I only have a little bit of time. But so I think the key to thinking about this is the premise is that fossil-fueled climate change has been catastrophic so far and will be apocalyptic going forward. And to evaluate predictions about the future, I always look at their track record. And it is false that fossil-fueled climate change is catastrophic so far. And we can measure this very clearly because we can measure how many people die from climate-related disasters. And that number not only hasn't increased, it has decreased by a factor of 50, so a 98% decrease over the last century. And the basic mechanism is very simple. Any new climate challenges that have been caused by rising GHG emissions, and I think there are some, particularly heat-related, they've been overwhelmed by our increased resilience, or what I call climate mastery. So the challenges, whatever they have been, are trivial compared to the increase in mastery. And if you try to think about the future of climate and you don't recognize that we're getting better and better at dealing with all kinds of climate disasters and climate challenges, then you can't think about this issue intelligently. So people say climate change is real. Yes, we do have an impact on climate, but equating that with climate catastrophe is wrong. And then saying that the US, which is 1/7 of the world's emissions and has no control over global emissions, except for legitimate innovation, not government dictated nonsense, but legitimate innovation like a nuclear, to say that we're gonna save the planet, A, the planet doesn't need saving, and B, it's a farce that you're gonna do it by forcing people to use a bunch of junk and then restricting our ability. So I consider the whole IRA just ridiculously dishonest. I think that if they were honest, they would say, hey, everyone needs to be poor to avoid climate catastrophe. And if they said that, I would take it seriously.
I'm going to cut you off there, but I appreciate the answer. I'm going to now give my ranking member 5 minutes for Q&A.
All right, thank you. As I mentioned before, yesterday the Federal Reserve cut interest rates by 0.5%, 50 basis points due to falling inflation, which has been supported by decreases in energy prices. Mr. Higgins, how much have energy prices decreased since enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act 2 years ago?
So gas prices have fallen from a peak of $5 to $3.30 or less. Natural gas prices for commercial and industrial users have fallen. Crude oil prices are now half of their level before. And overall energy costs, inflation has stopped and now has gone into deflation territory. It's 7.7% lower under the measure of the Consumer Price Index.
Thank you. One of the things you mentioned in your opening testimony, I'm glad that you pointed it out, is that climate change also has a cost. While we're looking at perhaps potential costs of certain government policies in any realm, climate change itself already has a cost. Talk to any homeowner in a coastal area attempting to get home insurance right now, especially in the state of Florida. It is at crisis level. So the goals of the Inflation Reduction Act included, of course, addressing climate change and supporting a transition long-term to clean energy, which will lower costs for American families. Can you talk about further how climate change contributes to increased costs for consumers as well as inflation?
As I mentioned, there were $28 billion disasters last year. That totaled $90 billion.
Yes, sir. 28 disasters that were $1 billion or more?
Exactly. A total of $90 billion in damages to property. And that's helping to drive the insurance cost premium crisis that you're talking about. So in California, for example, insurance prices rose 800% between 2015 and 2021, largely driven by wildfire costs, which add between $400 and $900 billion in annual costs to the U.S. economy. That's not just in California, right? We experienced the smoke last summer here in DC, for example. And the extreme weather in 2023, as Russia was attacking Ukrainian grain supplies and exports, it was one of the main disruptors of global food prices because there were droughts and dry conditions at the same time in India, Indonesia, and Europe. These effects of climate change that we are already feeling are very costly, and fighting climate change and slowing the pace of it is going to save us in the long run. Every 1 degree of global temperature rise could cut global GDP by 12% over this century.
Now, since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, can you talk about the ways in which American consumers have benefited from the tax credits and other incentives in the bill? And then also address, I pointed out there have been 300,000 new jobs created directly as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. Perhaps you could address that as well. So both on the consumer side, but also on the employment side.
Yes, thank you. The new rebates and credits that are made available by the Inflation Reduction Act equip households who want to make an upgrade to their furnace or to replace their water heater. It makes it more affordable for them to do that. In fact, there's a new rebates program that's just being rolled out this year through the states that can offer, that can cover up to 100% of the costs for low-income households of replacing their air conditioning, furnaces, electric panels. This is an extraordinary benefit for households that want to make this change. And it adds up to real jobs. So there have been over 300,000 jobs that have been created already. And the pace of clean energy job growth is one of the strongest of all the sectors in the economy.
No wonder we've had stronger growth than anyone predicted just a couple of years ago. Already yesterday, you had two new sources increasing their projection of 3% economic growth at a time that inflation is falling. Finally, obviously, and as I mentioned in my opening statement, there's a real risk that we would move backwards. I've talked about Trump's Project 2025, which is extreme to the max. Can you talk about how in Project 2025 there's a discussion or a commitment to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act and how that would impact consumers?
Taking away the opportunity to use these credits would hurt consumers. It reduces their choices, it makes home energy less affordable, and it would undercut the communities that are banking on the new factories that are being built. It would reduce U.S. economic competitiveness globally. It adds up to significant cuts, over $300 billion in lost GDP just by the end of 2030. And it would cut 750,000 direct jobs, which is one part of $1.7 million $1.7 million in job losses indirectly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now you have 5 minutes to Mr. McClintock from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was amusing to hear the ranking member warn about the impending shutdown just hours after he voted against a measure that would prevent a shutdown, but I'll save that for another day. Mr. Higgins, how would you assess California's energy policies?
California has been dealing with climate change, I think, at an accelerated basis and has attempted to resolve that through a measure.
Yes, they have done quite a bit of that, and there's a cost to that. We now have the third highest electricity prices in the country, and I can tell you personally, on Tuesday morning at Sacramento Airport, regular gasoline was selling for $5.26 a gallon. The problem that you and your friends have is that people can remember how they were doing 4 years ago, and people also know exactly how they're doing in their own lives today. And when you try to tell them otherwise, you just look foolish. You know, the day Donald Trump left office, America was energy independent for the first time in 62 years. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was full, and a gallon of gasoline averaged $2.39 a gallon. Now, that wasn't an accident. A Republican president and a Republican Congress had won the greatest regulatory relief in American history. American oil and gas exploration was ramping to historic levels. The Keystone Pipeline was under construction, promising to pump an additional 830,000 barrels of Canadian crude oil a day into the American economy. And all that changed on the first day of the Biden-Harris administration. They canceled the Keystone Pipeline, killing 11,000 construction jobs in the process. They closed federal lands to further oil exploration. They closed the Arctic to further leasing. As gasoline prices skyrocketed to historic highs, they began draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. It's now at a 40-year low. And when that wasn't nearly enough to bring down prices, they relaxed oil sanctions on Iran, flooding the dictatorship with oil revenues that have been used to fund terrorism around the world. And meanwhile, under Biden and Harris, electricity prices have ballooned 30%. Mr. Epstein, the ranking member boasts that American production is up. But doesn't production take years to bring online? And the production today was made possible by the regulatory relief under Trump?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's really simple, right? Joe Biden ran on, I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuel, and as I said, has done everything he could get away with to restrict production. So the fact that it's gone up is obviously in spite of him, not because of him. He didn't promise record oil production. It's just something he wants to take credit for, much like President
In fact,
Obama.
they keep telling us oil production is evil.
Yeah, so it's
And
just,
then they boast
it's
about-
opportunistic. I don't know if I can comment on California, but I'm a Californian. Is that okay?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And I want to give people a resource, by the way, because there have been many false claims made today. And I looked at Mr. Higgins' testimony last week. If people just go to alexepstein.substack.com, I refuted 12 of the myths that he said, I think, last week, which he also said today. And then if you also go there, look up every myth about net zero refuted, and you'll basically cover everything that's been said. California, that report he mentioned by Energy Innovation, that is a total trash report. They excluded California, and they blame California energy prices on climate change. You know that's not true. And also our wildfire problems are because of green policies that prevent us from doing proper forest management to reduce the fuel load. It's very easy to manage forests well. We don't do it because of green reasons. So California, which is a pretty self-contained grid, although we depend on a bunch of
In
others,
fact, I'm going to...
that's a model of green energy.
I've got to point out, UCLA did a study of the 2020 fires and concluded that those fires alone released twice the carbon dioxide as California's extremely expensive and disastrous regulations have prevented in the prior 20 years combined. This is just insanity. They say this is to combat climate change, but the climate keeps changing as it has for 4.5 billion years. And these leftist zealots obsess over a 1 degree increase in global temperatures over the next century, but they couldn't care less that they're making it increasingly difficult for American families to make ends meet or to heat their homes in sub-freezing winters or cool their homes in triple-digit summers. Meanwhile, they poured billions of taxpayer funds into these failed green energy schemes that have produced the worst inflation that Americans have experienced in 40 years. And the market for the electric vehicles is utterly collapsed as consumers have discovered the high costs and low performance and dangerous unreliability of this technology. Ms. Jackson, in the few seconds I've got remaining, could you kind of give us just an overview of what that's doing to an average family in our country?
You know, you mentioned California, but I want to say this. One of the things that the California's environmental policies have done is create artificial scarcity in home ownership, so that you have the most segregated communities in the country. And we have the lowest home ownership for minorities in the state of California since Jim Crow.
Well, I just say all of us in California, at least if things get bad enough, have 49 other states to move to. If we allow these people to destroy our country, where are we going to go? I yield back.
I think the gentleman from California now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Kildee from Michigan.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member Boyle, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today and sharing your perspective. I really do appreciate it. Mr. Higgins, as a fellow alum of the University of Michigan, I'm not going to ask you anything about football, not this year anyway, but I will have a question or two for you. As I listen to some of my colleagues, it's somewhat interesting to hear them talk about an energy crisis in a country where they have been trying for months to derail the efforts, because they happen to have been led by Democrats and the Biden-Harris administration, to bring down energy costs for consumers and to create new manufacturing jobs that pay a good wage and actually do allow people to take care of their families in a way that they ought to be able to. For instance, just last week, House Republicans put a bill on the floor to completely undermine the electric vehicle tax credit from the Inflation Reduction Act. This bill would have hurt American manufacturing, a source of many of those good-paying jobs. It would have raised taxes on American families who are attempting to purchase one of those vehicles, and it would have jeopardize new investments in hundreds of thousands of jobs in my home state of Michigan. And I think we do need to set the record straight. The effort to undermine the EV tax credit is interesting because in 2017, when Republican-led Congress scoured the tax code for every change that they could possibly imagine, they left intact the electric vehicle tax credit. But unlike our proposal, unlike the Inflation Reduction Act, allowed for a person making $1 million a year to purchase a $300,000 electric vehicle and claim the credit for it. Under our policy, we put caps, income caps, and MSRP caps, auto price caps, so that the eligibility for the credit was going to who we intended it to go to. For the first time, though, we are seeing an increase, first time in a long time, coming from a manufacturing state, an increase in manufacturing. We lost manufacturing jobs under the previous administration. We've significantly gained manufacturing jobs under this administration. We've seen over $175 billion in private investment in auto manufacturing, in battery production, critical minerals. These investments are putting people to work in good-paying jobs, and I can point to those jobs. I see them in my home district, in mid-Michigan, companies like SK Siltron in Bay County. Americans have saved $1 billion on new vehicle purchases from this tax cut this year, an average American saving $1,750 a year. We've seen manufacturing pull back their supply chains from China, reinvesting here in the United States in Americans and American auto workers. So when we talk about energy crisis and then try to undermine some of the efforts that we're engaging to try to bring down the costs of this transition to cleaner energy. And of course, we can stand here, sit here, listen, and continue to hear the denial that there's anything called climate change. I mean, if that's the starting point for the conversation, it kind of nullifies anything that anybody's trying to do to address it. So I wonder, Mr. Higgins, if you could, just in the brief time we have, just describe what the repeal of the EV credit would do on job creation, on the cost for families purchasing a vehicle, and most importantly, on our economic competitiveness when it comes to auto supply chains. I mean, China will dominate the EV space if, in fact, we don't have an industrial policy that allows us to be prepared for that transition. Mr. Higgins.
So China has been trying to dominate the electric vehicle supply chain and export markets. And their exports are surging around the world, but not here in the United States. Here we've invested more than $75 billion in manufacturing since the Inflation Reduction Act, and largely for EVs, which is creating new job opportunities, as you have described. And this is really critical. It's helping to reshape the global supply chains. It's paired with incentives not only for the purchase of a new vehicle, but also a used vehicle, and incentives for manufacturing at each stage of the supply chain. So the assembly of the car, before that the battery, before that the battery cells, before that the critical minerals processing. And at each stage in the process, it gives the United States leverage over the global supply chains. It's helping to keep us competitive with China and prevents the terrible effects that would have on our domestic industry.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. And again, I thank all the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kildee. We now yield 5 minutes to our colleague, Mr. General Jack Bergman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. Let's get right to the point. Energy is the lifeblood of any economy, and an abundant, reliable supply is essential for sustained economic growth and prosperity. We as a country are blessed to have an abundant level of resources and clean methods of extracting those resources as we move forward. But yet, on day one of the current administration, the Harris-Biden administration, there was a war declared on the energy industry because of whatever agenda. I can't imagine why it will be done, but to that everyday American trying to do the right thing and be able to afford it, this attacked all Americans. I expect much of today's discussion will be centered on the administration's unprecedented assault on domestic energy producers and exporters, rightfully so. However, it would be a mistake not to also highlight the Harris-Biden administration's attacks on energy imports. While I'm sure the witnesses before us today are all very familiar with the administration's cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline, I'd like to instead draw attention to a different pipeline currently under attack, one that runs through Michigan's 1st District, Enbridge Line 5. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit an article from the Consumer Energy Alliance titled "The Regional Economic and Fiscal Impact of an Enbridge Line 5 Shutdown" into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. For more than 70 years, Line 5 has been a crucial piece of energy infrastructure, not just for Michigan, but the entire Midwest region. Originating in Superior, Wisconsin, traveling through both Michigan's Upper and Lower Peninsula and terminating in Sarnia, Ontario, the pipeline transports roughly 540,000 barrels of crude oil and natural gas liquids every day. And basically, they turn into the heat that's used in our homes. They turn into other things that are essential to our American economy being structured so that we can live prosperously and raise our families. So when you think about the value of something that already exists and to maintain its safety, to maintain its operation, it's a whole lot better, I think, for all going forward when we do the right thing for the right reason on the front end, not just wholesale shut down things because of some unique agenda that doesn't reflect reality. So just give you, I don't want to dwell on this too long, but just if Line 5 were to shut down, what that would mean, a $20.8 billion loss in economic activity, an $8.3 billion reduction in combined gross state product, $2.4 billion in foregone labor earnings and salaries, wages, and benefits, 33,755 jobs lost, and 2.65 million lower annual state tax revenues. So while Consumer Energy Alliance report does not include the likely increase in gasoline prices or the downstream impacts of higher transportation costs, as refinery inputs become more costly without Line 5, another report from HIS Market Research does. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a report from HIS Market Research that estimates that Line 5's closure would result in higher gas prices for the Midwest region, likely around 20 cents a gallon minimum.
Without objection, so ordered.
Now that I've kind of laid the groundwork here and we don't have much time left, Ms. Jackson, much of your work is focused on debunking the faulty narratives that the Harris-Biden administration's extreme green energy policies are benefiting working and middle-class families. How would closing a major pipeline like Line 5 in favor of green agenda impact the working and middle-class folks of Michigan's Upper Peninsula?
Everything they're doing right now is a regressive tax against the poor and middle-class families because we have to pay a higher percentage of our income towards more expensive goods and services because of the shortage of affordable fuel. You know, I've heard a lot about these jobs that are supposed to be created. These are make-work jobs, and even the Washington Post said that the green energy jobs would only replace 20% of the coal jobs. We're losing tons of jobs that the middle class and the poor have historically been able to take advantage of in manufacturing and industrial jobs. That's what built the middle class in this country, especially among Black Americans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I have one quick response from Ms. Furch? Ms. Roth. Okay. You authored a book. Could you speculate as to some of the downstream economic impacts that a major pipeline's closure, like Line 5, would result in? Just give me some worst case.
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Yeah, well, basically, it would result in fewer jobs going to our refiners, more expensive fuel for consumers, both in terms of heating oil and gasoline. The North American Energy Platform is a perfect way to not only produce oil and natural gas, but also refine it and get it out to consumers.
Thank the
Thank you.
gentlelady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Colleague, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Bobby Scott, unless he needs another 30 seconds to follow up with a question. I'll be fair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Epstein, It's my understanding that your view is we'd be better off if we used more, not less fossil fuel. Is that right?
Oh, can you hear me? Yes, and I have my book as a resource, Fossil Future, here. I have copies for any member who wants one to explain the full case.
Thank you. Mr. Higgins, you indicated that there's a significant cost in doing nothing. There are reports that some cities are experiencing record consecutive days over 100 degrees. What kind of impact does that have on costs to families?
Extreme heat is a real tax on families' welfare. It means that kids can't enjoy their summer vacations. It can mean schools are canceling activities, and it can send people to the emergency room. So there have been more than $1 billion in extra summertime healthcare costs because of climate change, and more than 230,000 ER visits per day when there are heat waves in the United States.
And what does it do to your energy cost?
You have to run your air conditioner, if you're lucky enough to have one, at higher rates. It's more expensive to do so. Often, air conditioners are even old and inefficient and need to be improved. And the costs of heating are not always as well supported by programs that are meant to address affordability. That's something that the Biden-Harris administration has been changing with the LIHEAP program to make it available for cooling costs as well as heating costs.
Well, what additional investments in weatherization assistance programs and LIHEAP would be beneficial to families?
Yes, LIHEAP, which is the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, and the Weatherization Assistance Program are two key drivers for affordability, and Project 2025 would eliminate them.
What impact do the home energy rebates have on, you mentioned low-quality air conditioning. What effect would that have on the ability of low to moderate income families being able to afford to upgrade?
Yes, upfront costs can be expensive, which is why these new programs that the Inflation Reduction Act enacted are so critical. So the home energy efficiency electrification and appliance rebates that you mentioned can cover up to 100% of the costs for low-income families to replace their energy systems, and for moderate-income families, up to half of the cost.
And what does that do to their monthly expense?
So if you switch from an inefficient heating system to a heat pump, you can save between $60 and $800 in annual energy costs, depending on which source of energy you were using before the switch.
Thank you. Now, some of us believe that climate change is a problem, others apparently don't. How does the IRA encourage private companies to get into the supply chain?
One of the tax credits that's available, called 45X, encourages domestic manufacturing at every stage of the clean energy economy. So from batteries to wind turbine manufacturing to solar panel manufacturing, it provides a guaranteed dollar per unit of production, which companies then can realize will justify their upfront investments. In addition, the Inflation Reduction Act offers loans and grants and tax credits to defray the upfront construction costs also. And this is part of why we have seen clean energy manufacturing investment quadruple since the enactment of the law.
Have any companies taken advantage of this?
Yes, there have been many hundreds of projects, including more than 290 projects in low-income communities, more than 117 projects in rural areas, more than 350 projects in districts represented by Republicans. So this is $493 billion in actual investment so far.
Including some in my district. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're back.
I thank the gentleman and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Ron Estes from Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all our witnesses for joining us today at this important hearing. You know, for more than 3.5 years, the Biden-Harris administration's waged war on American energy production. Coupled with inflation, their actions have produced the energy crisis crushing Americans today. Not just the invasion of Ukraine or any other excuse that the administration tries to hide behind. In the first year of the Biden-Harris administration, they ended the Keystone XL pipeline, proposed tax increases on oil and gas companies, and pushed policies that benefited green, quote-unquote, energy and Chinese companies and their benefits over reliable American energy. By the time Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, Biden's policies had already pushed the national weekly average from $2.40 up to $3.53. In fact, as the ranking member noted earlier, we're still up at over $3.20, again, higher than the $2.40 that national gas price that President Biden inherited. Rather than reverse their anti-American energy policies, the Biden-Harris administration traded in our safety net of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and drained 180 million barrels to bring the SPR to its lowest level ever. After dragging their feet for more than 2 years, the Biden-Harris administration took action earlier this year to refill the SPR. But rather than actually refilling it, they've tried to claim that purchasing 40 million barrels and canceling the sale of another 140 million is the same as fully replenishing the SPR. Ms. Fercott Roth, would you consider canceling the sale of the 140 million barrels the same as replenishing the SPR?
No, definitely not.
Yeah, we're kind of at the lowest level. We're down to 40% of the capabilities that we were at, and down to the level we were in the early 80s in terms of and the whole reason for having a Strategic Petroleum Reserve was for a cutoff in supply and not to manipulate prices.
Exactly.
I mean, beyond concerns about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, I have grave concerns that the Biden-Harris administration war on fossil fuels is making it more difficult for our country to meet its energy needs, just as demand for energy is growing. As noted earlier, U.S. energy consumption has been increasing. In fact, it's increased by 123% since 1960. But the domestic energy production has kept pace, increasing by 140% in the same time. And since 2005 alone, U.S. energy production increased by 48%. This is significant since during the same period, net emissions decreased by 16.6%. And as noted earlier, we're producing more oil now than previously, but a lot of that's due to the investments that were being made before President Biden took office and began his policy of trying to stop the growth of energy production. Contrary to what many believe about and propagate, oil and gas production doesn't necessarily result in increased emissions or harms to the environment. Results like this are possible in the U.S., but not guaranteed elsewhere. China's carbon dioxide emissions, for example, increased by 93.9% since 2005. So if the administration really wants to cut emissions, they should encourage the production of clean domestic energy using an all-of-the-above approach rather than picking winners and losers. In Kansas, we have a thriving oil, gas, wind, solar, and nuclear energy producers to power our state as we work towards an all-of-the-above strategy. Mr. Epstein, how is energy freedom, which encompasses an all-of-the-above approach, more beneficial to the U.S. consumer?
Well, I would think of energy freedom as a best of the above approach, not an all of the above approach. I don't really like the idea of all of the above. We don't want to use anything that happens to exist. I mean, we don't want to use wood and animal dung for electricity, right? So I think it's important. So with energy freedom, all the sources would be allowed to compete, but they would have to compete in a fair way. And so, for example, with wind and solar, it's really important that they be required in some way to provide reliable electricity. Right now, they're allowed to provide unreliable electricity and get the same amount or more than reliable. That's like a car rental company that rents you cars that work a third of the time and you don't know when, and you pay the same as for a reliable car. Like that would never work in rental cars. So yeah, energy freedom allows you to have maximum energy abundance now and maximum energy innovation going forward. And I think both parties want energy innovation. You need to get the government out of the way with things like NEPA just ruining development of all kinds. You need to get the EPA to stop attacking things. You need to reform the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Like if we want innovation, we need to focus on freedom, not on subsidizing things and robbing Americans.
Yep. And as you noted before, that even having solar and wind, you also have to provide a base percentage to compensate when they're not producing.
Yeah, so you better make sure they're cost effective. So we need grid reform so that people are actually incentivized to provide reliable electricity.
Oh, great, and I appreciate y'all being here. We're talking about, it's so important to be able to talk about energy because that drives the economy, it drives It drives our civilized life that we live today. So thank you all for today, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my friend from Kansas, and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from California, Mr. Scott Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. I got to say that it's a little sometimes confounding to hear that the Biden administration is getting in the way of energy production. At the same time, we've had more oil and gas production ever than before. So I would just actually say I agree with Mr. Epstein on a couple things he just said. And in fact, we're going to face higher prices, largely because of the demand pull from the first increase in demand for energy we've seen in decades. We have been growing, but we've been efficient, so we haven't needed big production increases. Now we're going to see a greater demand for energy because of manufacturing returning to the United States, somewhat because of the IRA, because of electrification, and because of the demand from AI for huge amounts of electricity. In fact, I heard the one Microsoft facility for AI might require itself 5 gigawatts, which is bigger than the whole complex of nuclear power we just built in Georgia. So this is a challenge for all of us, but let's just recognize that we've never produced more oil and gas than we are today, despite the rhetoric, either from the Biden administration or about the Biden administration. Also, I couldn't agree more. We've done work on increasing the production of nuclear power. That's been bipartisan. I'm working really hard to get NEPA out of the way. I agree with you. I think it's been a huge delaying effect with not the kind of environmental quality results we need, and we need to reform the grid. I would just say, too, the problem I've had with the grid here is I can't get Republicans interested in talking about transmission, interregional transmission. We couldn't even have a hearing in the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'd love to do that in a bipartisan way. We've seen the Republicans in the way of transmission reform, but we all need to be in this together. The other thing I just point out is that we are going to see the cost of climate change also affect consumers. And recent studies found that the global cost of climate change stemming from extreme weather, natural disasters, the effects of a warming planet could reach $3.1 trillion a year by 2050. So that includes costs of damage to infrastructure, property, and public health. And these costs will only increase over time as the destruction from climate change becomes more severe. We've got to respond to that. I think the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act do try to do some of that and try to increase new technologies through subsidies in clean energy. And I think that's appropriate as these technologies are getting off the ground, because we do want not all of the above, as you said, but we want many of the above, and some of them won't get started on their own. I would also point out wildfires have already burned over 6 million acres this year, and as wildfire season continues, it's clear that the time for action is now. That's continuing to raise the cost of living, the cost of health care, lower the quality of life for my constituents. Earlier this year, insurance rates for California homeowners increased by an average of 34%. Utility wildlife prevention and mitigation costs are nearing $5 billion a year. So I would point out that solutions exist. Our bipartisan Fix Our Forests Act will restore forest health, increase resilience to catastrophic wildfires, and protect communities by enabling landscape-scale work to increase the pace and effectiveness of forest management and restoration projects. Mr. Higgins, do you agree that the benefits of taking decisive actions to address climate change now, whether that's investing in American energy and manufacturing or through the passage of critical wildlife legislation, will outweigh the initial costs?
Yes, I strongly agree. Overall, the Inflation Reduction Act will cut deficits, and the actions to take to fight climate change also cut energy costs.
What do you think the economic and climate impacts of reversing these investments would be? That's something that the former president, Mr. Trump, has promised to do.
So Energy Innovation studied the Project 2025 proposals and found that it would cut gross domestic product over $300 billion in 2030. It would cost 750,000 direct jobs. It would increase household energy costs above their 2021 levels. It would keep emissions over 4.7 gigatons indefinitely. That's not even counting the proposals to raise taxes on middle-income families or tariffs.
I would just say too, one thing that households feel is energy costs. Another thing they feel is insurance costs. I'm going to run out of time, but it seems to me that what we can do to keep all costs down is important. And do you believe that the investments made through the IRA and IIJ will have a positive effect, considering that, for lower premiums in U.S. households? Mr. Higgins.
Yes, and I think more needs to be done directly to address insurance premiums. But if we can stop the climate from changing as fast, it's going to make it easier for us to keep up and prevent those costs from spiraling into households everywhere.
That's a conversation I want to continue to have, but energy abundance is important for all of us, and I look forward to discussing that more, and I yield back.
I thank my friend from California. Now yield to our colleague from Wisconsin, Glenn Grothman.
Thank you. Obviously, I think one of the big themes of this administration is we seem to have more and more people aim for government assistance, more and more people in the billionaire class, and we try to squeeze the middle class, which has always been the backbone of America. I'd like to talk a little bit, whichever one of you feels most appropriate to speak up, on the cost of electric cars and the effect it's going to have on the middle class. One of you feels the champion of that? Okay, good. I think there are three things that go into the cost of a car. What is the effect of this demand that we buy these electric cars as far as the initial price of a car? Am I going to have to pay more for a new car than I did my last car if I buy it in 2032?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious. The reason they need to force it on us is because we wouldn't buy it voluntarily. So that means it's not the most cost-effective option. So yeah, it increases the cost and it decreases the effectiveness. So for many families, it's not nearly as versatile as a gasoline car.
Well, you've got the cost up front, and as I understand it, talking to my auto dealers, $25,000 more for my next car than the car I just got if I got to buy electric.
Well, there's that, but then there's many hidden costs. Texas Public Policy Foundation did a good study which shows $10,000 to $20,000 of us subsidizing per car. So these are incredibly subsidized through all sorts of things like zero emissions credits. And yeah, so we're just paying a fortune for these things directly and indirectly.
I really don't like the way they're trying to squeeze the middle class, which has always been
I would like to add that most of minorities are priced out of the EV market. They just don't make sense. And when you think about Black Americans that have a median income of $56,000 a year, which is someone doing well, the average demographic of an EV owner makes $100,000 or more, has owned their own home, and they're white and they're educated. So most African Americans and most minorities are already priced out of the market. They can't even afford a electric vehicle.
Right.
And so the alternatives that they're providing for us is public transportation, which does not work when you need a job.
Well, I will point out, I don't think for the billionaire class that I think runs the Democrat Party, public transportation is not a big deal there. And like so many things, be it your electric bill, be it your car payment on your new car, if you're a billionaire, you don't even make those payments yourself. Probably have an accountant do it for you. So, but you're right. I think it's so damaging for the average person. Of course, the cost of a car isn't just initially what you pay for it. I wasn't aware until I talked the other way. When you do want to buy a new car and you trade in your old car, is it right that the trade-in you're going to get on an electric car is less than you get on a combustion engine car? Is that another way they're going to try to nail the middle class?
And the trade-ins are in comparison to gas combustion engines, are way lower. But what they're also doing is increasing the cost of gas-powered cars because they're forcing the EV agenda on individuals. So now the middle class is getting hit in two ways. They're actually being priced out of the private car ownership market.
Right. There's another cost to a car that we haven't talked about today. I think maybe you ought to talk about a little bit, and that is the cost of insurance. I know in Wisconsin, almost every other state, you're required to have insurance if you're going to have a car. What is the plan for middle America when they begin to have to buy insurance on their new EV? What is that going to do to the middle class there?
Yeah, well, it's probably likely to be much greater because if the battery goes in an EV, that means it's a very large expense to replace it. And that's why you can't sell used EVs. People don't want to take the risk of a battery going. And about 71% of car sales in the United States are used. Most people buy used cars, and they don't want to buy used EVs. So that really messes with the market.
Well, right, and isn't it true that if you get into a car accident, it's much more expensive to repair the EV?
And they can also catch fire. It's much easier for these EVs to catch fire.
Right, the result will be another, that's a payment that I think a lot of people in America make monthly on insurance. That's another way you work towards this plan of getting rid of the middle class, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I did the calculation this morning. An EV would cost about $1,400 a month for a minority who's usually in the subprime loan market. If you're making $56,000, basically your income for a month is $3,000. You're talking about somebody who needs to invest half of their income.
Yeah, I just want to get in one more question here. Another way we're nailing the middle class on things you need, of course, is the price of food is going up. And part of that, when I talk to farmers, is the increased cost of fertilizer, which of course you need to be a farmer today. Could you describe, is this green agenda increasing the cost of fertilizer? And is that one of the reasons why we're making it so difficult to buy enough food in Joe Biden's America?
10-second response.
Yeah, I mentioned in my testimony, yeah, the price of energy determines the price of everything, and modern agriculture depends on natural gas-derived fertilizer and diesel fuel, so anything you do to restrict the supply of those makes food more expensive.
Thank you much.
Thank the gentleman, and now yield 5 minutes to our colleague from Virginia, Mr. Bob Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of our witnesses. Thank you particularly, Mr. Epstein, for your incredible leadership and expertise on this issue. And I just have a couple comments on the EVs from my friend Mr. Grothman's questions. But EVs are the biggest hoax since climate change generally, or man-made climate change, by the way. And I know that everybody even on the panel may not agree with me on that. But the battery components and how they're constructed and the environmental impact, where we get the batteries from, the danger of the explosions and fires and so forth that come from electric vehicles, the weight of the vehicles that are 50% heavier than gas-powered vehicles, and the fact that the roads and the parking garages across the country could not handle EVs if we were all driving them. To Ms. Jackson's point, that almost everyone who has an EV, it's their second or their third vehicle, their extra vehicle when they can putter around town because they don't want to drive it across the country because it's impractical, and it's incredible. What a hoax forced upon the American people, and an egregious abuse of power by the administration to even think that they would have the right or should have the right to tell Americans what kind of vehicles they can own or that they can drive. It's incredible that the other side promotes and supports that, number one, and that the American people, to some degree, have surrendered their sovereignty, their independence, their freedom to have the government tell us what kind of vehicle we drive, and it's not even in our best interest if we were all to succumb or surrender to that. Mr. Epstein, you often talk about the concept of energy poverty, or the difficulty of some people, and Ms. Jackson has spoken to this as well, to afford the most basic of their energy needs, whether it's domestically or internationally, and how much that hurts people. Can you just speak a little bit more to that, Mr. Epstein? And then I'd like Ms. Jackson to speak to it as well.
And this is a problem globally and in the U.S. I mean, so energy poverty basically means you can't afford to use a lot of energy. And you need to use a lot of energy to have a modern life, to have abundant food, clothing, shelter, medical care, et cetera. So every single thing we do to restrict the availability of energy, and as I mentioned, by restricting fossil fuels and by forcing us to pay money for uneconomic alternatives, both of those restrict the availability of energy. We make every single person poorer in the world, really, but particularly the poorest people feel it the most. And I just want to give a mention of, we have 3 billion people in the world using less electricity than a typical American refrigerator. We have 6 billion people who use an amount of energy people in this room would consider totally unacceptable. The world is desperately poor, and what they want to do is rise out of poverty, and that requires energy. And for the foreseeable future, that means we need more fossil fuels. That's why I said to one of the representatives, we need more fossil fuels, not less. That's what I talk about in Fossil Future. So it's just crazy to think we're sacrificing billions of people's opportunities in the name of preventing, a degree or two of warming, when we've already shown we're incredibly good at dealing with a warmer planet. And by the way, far more people still die of cold than of heat. So there's nothing to say even a warmer planet is worse objectively. But a warmer planet with abundant energy is a great planet. A colder planet or the same planet with no energy is a terrible planet.
It's my understanding that burning wood actually is producing more energy on the planet still than solar and wind does.
They
might,
juice up renewable numbers using that. If they want to say X% renewable, they like to add hydro, even though the green movement is anti-hydro, anti-large hydro. And yeah, in Europe, often they juice up the renewable numbers they often buy wood pellets from America, take them across the sea with oil, and then they burn them there, and they call that renewable.
so oil tankers going across the ocean to.
With wood made using diesel equipment in the United States. So this just points to a lot of this is a scam. If you think CO2 emissions are a grave threat, then you have to recognize the only way to deal with that is to make people poorer. But we have to have an honest conversation. You can't say we're going to restrict fossil fuels, we're going to force you to use uneconomic things, and you're going to become rich, let alone do it randomly to various cronies, which is what the IRA did. So it's a very dishonest conversation right now.
And nothing has brought more prosperity and industry to the world than fossil fuels. And a wealthy country like the United States, which is harmed by these ridiculous, unrealistic policies, far worse for third world countries, poorer nations, who we pretend we want to help as we try to force upon them our woke policies here. I wanted to have you talk a little bit about Europe, Ms. Fercott Roth and Ms. Jackson. But Ms. Jackson, I'll let you just tack on about what you were saying about lower income folks or minorities disproportionately impacted by these policies.
Absolutely. Energy poverty is when you have to spend more than 6% of your income on your energy needs. This country has forced everybody into energy poverty. But energy poverty leads to food insecurity. And food insecurity is causing right now developmental issues in children that's growing up right now. This is affecting family formations. It's affecting marriages. So what we're doing is putting people in a dangerous position that they're even setting their thermostats and living in unhealthy conditions in their homes because of their fear of energy poverty because they can't pay their bills. How are we not thinking about the impacts to people when we're thinking about these policies?
My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting Ms. Jackson answer. Thank you to our witnesses.
Thank you, my colleague, and let's give our newest member of the committee, Mr. Greg Lopez from the great state of Colorado, 5 minutes.
You know, as I sit here and listen to the conversations, it sounds to me like there's a lot of positive illusions that people are trying to present to the American people. You know, I reference these positive illusions sometimes to the boogeyman. I've heard about the shutdown. I consider that a boogeyman. You know, I hear about the climate change and green policies. I consider those boogeymans because those are the terminologies that people want to use to scare people, that we must do something. Of course, you know, nobody wants to deal with a boogeyman. You know, as I look at these green policies and the impacts it's having on the minority communities, I do believe that those individuals that are reciting numbers and saying what a great idea it is for the American economy, they truly have a disconnect with the minority community. They've never walked through the minority community. They've never had any interaction with the minority community. They just reference it like it's a badge of honor that they understand the minority community. As a minority myself, I can tell you that these green policies are not helping the Hispanic community. They're not helping the Black community. They're not helping the Asian community. They're helping a lot of other communities, but those are the communities that are not being helped. So, you know, as I look at this, I would like to ask a question of Ms. Jackson. Ms. Jackson, you have a very impressive resume, and I see that you've graduated from Colorado State University with an accounting degree in cum laude. My question refers to the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on working class Americans. We both share a background in business. Do you know how large the federal deficit is?
I don't know the exact number, but I know it's big. Sorry about that.
That's okay. You know, a lot of people don't. You know, it's $35 trillion, and it's growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. Would you agree that that amount is dangerous to have that much debt?
Yes.
Okay. And as a accounting major, I'm sure you know that even some debt is valuable. Too much can weigh down an enterprise. Would you say that the U.S. debt, now at 124% of GDP, is approaching a critical point and having harmful effects on the U.S. economy?
Absolutely.
I'm glad we share on the same page, but affected too much debt on the economy. What would you say about legislation that was supposed to cost $270 billion? Then it was supposed to cost $360 billion, and now it costs $492 billion, reduces tax revenue, and ends up with a final cost of $1.8 trillion over the 10-year window. That's what the IRA does through its energy tax credits, all while the debt keeps rising. What would you say to that?
I think that that's the most gross mismanagement. If it was a private industry, it would be bankrupt, our government would be. You know, it's very problematic. I hear a lot of people talking about how great the Inflation Reduction Act. I see mismanagement in a lot of the ways the money is being spent. The environmental justice money, 90% went to NGOs, never hit the community. Never. I go and travel to minority communities every day, and they're not taking advantage of these so-called tax credits because they don't own their homes. But everything you're doing right now is making sure that they're so expensive that they can't own a home. Yeah. So, you know, it's just serving one group of people who, frankly, has never asked us what we needed.
Mr. Higgins, you tout that the green policies, the rebates and credits really help Americans because they can, but correct me if I'm wrong, but before you can ask for a rebate, you first have to pay for the product. You first have to pay for the electric vehicle. You first have to pay for the solar panels. How would you explain to the minority community if they cannot afford to pay their own gas bill today? How would you convince them that a rebate or a credit that they must first spend $15,000 on, how is that going to benefit them?
The tax credits work as you say, but actually many of the new programs are rebates that are made available at the point of sale, including a $4,000 tax credit that's available for used car purchases for electric vehicles.
So a $4,000 tax credit?
It's a $4,000 tax credit available at the point of sale. You don't have to wait until you file your taxes a year later or whenever.
And what would be the average cost of that? Is that on any new vehicle?
I'm talking about the used car vehicle. For the new car vehicles, they're also available at the point of sale. But the used cars have an income cap and a sales cap, so it's for affordable vehicles.
So let me ask you this. You know, I spoke with some auto dealers the other day. They tell me they have so many EVs sitting in their lot because they can't sell them because the market's not looking for them. What are we going to do with that oversupply of those automobiles as they stand today?
Well, we see demand for EVs is growing. In fact, we think it'll be up to
That's not a true
2/3.
statement. I'm sorry, it's not.
Well, we can check the numbers.
I've checked the numbers, but I appreciate your comment. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Colorado. Now yield 5 minutes. Oh, let me, for the record, I've got our colleague from Wisconsin has something to submit for the record. I'm sorry to skip over you. Mr. Grothman?
Yeah, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit a study from the American Gas Association into the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you for your patience. Now, I yield 5 minutes to my friend from Texas, Mr. Chip Roy.
Thank the chairman. I thank the witnesses and your time for being here to help illuminate this important topic. I think it's one of the most important topics that we could possibly discuss because it's a direct impact on the well-being of the people that we represent. And I think we've got to address this and deal with, I think, what has been a significant amount of, to use a loaded term, misinformation that has been pushed and hoisted upon the American people. So to my colleagues who like to use the power of government to go after misinformation, I think maybe we need to think about how it's being used in context here. There's a couple of quick questions. I mean, that I think is really important. Mr. Epstein, you know, a lot of things are being said, and we can go through and refute it. You wisely noted you went through some reputations. I can't go through it all. But I think it's important for people to understand the context that we're operating under. We have China where, to the best of my rough knowledge, they have something like 1,100 coal-fired plants, and they're building maybe a plant and a half, or 2 plants a week, depending on the time of year. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, they have something like 300 new plants in the pipeline, which is way more than the U.S. is total coal capacity.
Correct. And we have basically 0 coal-fired plants in the pipeline. We're
We have
dismantling.
negative coal plants in the pipeline, which is an existential threat to the grid.
Correct. And we have limited natural gas plants in the pipeline because, and this is important, the subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, those subsidies, among other policies, are making it economically less feasible for people to invest in the production of natural gas in the market. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we have systematic preferences for unreliable electricity, and the IRA made that considerably worse.
And so even in Texas, which sits on a sea of available natural gas, to be able to produce natural gas-fired energy, Texas, putting aside the barriers to nuclear, which we ought to be talking more about, by the way, as well, and you speak about it regularly, in Texas, we have to have the government of Texas already under strain, having spent $13 billion to make up for a federal government that refuses to secure the border. The government of Texas is having to itself create natural gas production, wisely or not, that's a debate, through its government action without relying on the market, because the market has been constrained by these subsidies. Is that correct?
Mostly. I mean, Texas has some responsibility itself because it has its own kind of isolated market with ERCOT. Yeah, but if you look at the effect, just to elaborate a little bit on what you said, like when you basically rob American taxpayers and require them to pay for solar and wind, what happens is people just always use solar and wind whenever it's available, and that depletes the funds available to natural gas plants. So then you need to do another artificial intervention. So the key is get rid of all the preferences for unreliable electricity, and then real electricity will win.
Moving really quickly to the vehicles, the tailpipe rule. The tailpipe rule has been put in effect, and that will have in effect the requirement that we be producing effectively 2/3 of the vehicles in this country be EV by 2032, correct? Roughly?
Yes.
The impact on the average American family of that rule, what would that do in terms of cost of vehicles, cost of existing internal combustion engine vehicles, used market or new, availability of vehicles, particularly with the lack of infrastructure and materials in the states, which I'll get to in a minute? What would be the impact of that?
So just really quickly, I mean, it forces people to pay for more expensive vehicles. People don't realize how much they're paying with the subsidies, in part because the internal combustion engine vehicles end up subsidizing the EVs.
Right.
So there's that whole thing. I think the biggest cost that we haven't covered yet is the cost to the grid, because we're artificially restricting the supply of reliable electricity, as I mentioned, with shutting down coal plants. The new EPA rules would just destroy the grid. So we really need to prevent those, because they prevent new natural gas plants from being built to replace coal. But we're talking about a grid that's already in crisis thanks to government-dictated green energy. We're talking about forcing EVs, so you artificially restrict supply. You dramatically artificially increase demand. That is just a guaranteed death sentence for the grid. We need to stop that immediately.
Well, and if I just real quick, Ms. Jackson, real quick, because I got one more question. What would that do to the families that you're talking about that represent minority families, poor families in the United States?
That would basically take away private car ownership. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia did a study and said that you can decrease the poverty rate of African Americans if they have a car. Basically, you're going to subjugate them to poverty.
And so last question for Ms. Fercott Roth. I think another area here, and Mr. Epstein alluded to it, talking about the subsidies and what it's doing to distort the market. But there's another aspect to this, which is in pursuit of this agenda, and that's what it is. In pursuit of this agenda, notwithstanding all the impact that we've just discussed, aren't we having to create essentially a government-run industry effectively to go deal with the fact that China has a monopoly on the minerals? China is driving a lot of the production of the stuff to drive the green energy. But we've got, firms that are, quote, pleaded with the government to go beyond supporting capital costs for construction of new mines and processing facilities to take a more active role in the minerals market. In other words, we're creating a government-run cottage industry to prop up a market that cannot exist on its own because it's being subsidized by government to the detriment of hardworking Americans, driving up the price of goods and services, and then you got to have the government backfill to create a market for something that doesn't exist because people are demanding it.
Exactly, yes. And also, if you look at the economics of providing power, if you're requiring wind and solar on the grid, then your baseload natural gas runs less often. So it's less economical to invest in that natural gas plant because it's just going to sit there as a backup to the solar and wind. And then you have the critical minerals that the government does not allow to be mined here in the United States, and we're turning over that to China too.
In other words, wind and solar isn't cheaper. It's subsidized by the reliable energy, which makes it appear cheaper on paper.
Right.
Yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Smucker from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the last few years, it's been clear that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's administration have actively participated in policies that weaken our energy independence. My state of Pennsylvania is home to some of the most abundant energy resources in the United States. Natural gas industry fracking support 123,000 jobs, generate $41 billion in economic activity. Yet, despite the abundance of these resources, the average household in Pennsylvania is spending almost $100 more on energy per month. So I find it really interesting. Pennsylvanians know bad energy policy when they see it, so it's not surprising at all that suddenly Kamala Harris denies that she wants to ban fracking. To stabilize our nation's fiscal trajectory, we've got to pursue policies that grow the economy, and I think unleashing American energy is one of the best ways to do it. In July, I, along with 25 of my Republican colleagues, wrote to EPA Administrator Reagan expressing concern with how the Clean Power Plant 2.0 plan will impact the PJM interconnection, which serves 65 million people across the Mid-Atlantic, including the district I represent. Specifically concerned with how those proposed rules will impact electric reliability and could lead to rolling blackouts. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter that letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask Ms. Jackson, and I'm not going to, but I wanted to talk about how the reliability of the grid is crucial for low-income families. But I want to, maybe we'll get to it, but I doubt it. I want to go to something else. I want to go back to something that was said by Mr. Kildee. Excuse me. And Mr. Kildee is a good friend, but he said something to the effect, Mr. Epstein, that, well, if folks here are saying that there's nothing like climate change, we shouldn't even have this conversation. And it's what I've heard so often, sort of the arrogance of individuals who believe that you really can't even question any of the dogma around climate change. I didn't hear you say that climate change doesn't exist. What I heard you say was that it's about the impact of climate change, how much that will impact us, and then how much resilience we will have to do that. So, just simply shutting down the conversation when someone doesn't agree just seems pretty bizarre to me. And I guess I'd like you to address that. We've heard a lot of claims here about how by 2050, we're going to see the food supply impacted. We already talked about wildfires. I know that hurricanes have been attributed to climate change, but that's been debunked. So I guess I'd like to get your perspective on that statement that was made earlier and on the kind of feedback you get on your positions.
Sure. So yeah, I think it's valuable here. I'm a philosopher and energy expert. So part of this is just the terminology and the arguments are very bad. So we want to be very precise. So when people say climate change, what they mean is man-made climate impact. That's really what they're focused on. So, and that's fine, and that's a legitimate thing to focus on, but what that is primarily a side effect of fossil fuel use, right? So we burn fossil fuels, we add more CO2 to the atmosphere, and it has some effect on climate. We can't quantify it perfectly, but it has some, and it's generally a warming effect. And it's important, if you think about it as a side effect of fossil fuel use, then you need to think both about the benefits of fossil fuels and about the side effect. And with the side effect itself, you need to be precise. So you mentioned you need to be clear about the magnitude, and you need to be even-handed. You can't just look at negative side effects, you have to look at positive. For example, more warmth in a world where far more people die of cold than of heat. So the problem with the discussion is it's so biased, it only looks at negative side effects of fossil fuels. It ignores the climate benefits directly. It ignores what I call the climate mastery or resilience benefits, so the fact that we're far more resilient. And as I mentioned, this shows up very clearly in the fact that we're far safer from climate than ever. So you can believe in climate impact and not believe in climate catastrophe, and in fact believe in a climate renaissance. Like, we're really safer than ever from climate. So it's just total BS to say, oh, do you believe in climate change? Do you believe fossil fuels have side effects? Therefore, you should get rid of them. That's like saying, do you believe antibiotics have side effects? Oh, if so, oh, no more antibiotics. It's just like third grade thinking that unfortunately is practiced by many smart people, including scientists. So glad to have the chance to address it.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I will get back, I have just a few seconds, the impact of the reliability of the grid on low-income households.
You know, most minorities live in multi-generational homes, which means there's always somebody there 24 hours. And if you have unreliable energy, that means that somebody's going to be impacted, whether it's grandma, whether it's kids, but we need reliable energy so that people don't live in unsafe conditions in their homes, and that's what's at stake for most minority homes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman and yield now you have 5 minutes to Mr. Yakum from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and to the witnesses for being here today to share your expertise on this important issue. American energy production is deeply connected to our economic security, our national security, our quality of life as Americans, and our nation's fiscal health. But under the Biden-Harris administration, oil and gas leases for on- and offshore production have been paused. Energy projects that would have reduced energy prices for the American people have been canceled. And radical climate activists have been empowered to block energy development at every turn. This war on energy has driven up energy prices for Americans and weakened our energy independence. In my home state of Indiana, the average Hoosier household is spending nearly $1,100 more per year on energy costs, thanks to the Biden-Harris energy policies. It takes an average of almost 6 years to clear the environmental permitting process. Litigation under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, can tie up energy projects for years. These delays cost our economy billions of dollars in unrealized economic growth and lost revenues. Unfortunately, this situation is about to get worse. The Biden-Harris administration took the bipartisan NEPA reforms and handed the pen to radical climate activists. As a result, the NEPA Phase 2 rule infused vague, woke climate change and, quote, environmental justice principles into an already burdensome process. Ms. Fercott-Roth, what kind of impact do you think the institutionalization of environmental justice will have on the judicial atmosphere as it relates to energy projects?
First of all, I think the term environmental justice is misnamed. It's not environmental justice making people's electricity costs go up or taking away their choice of vehicles. And all these new, so putting aside that, all these new regulations reduce investments in natural gas, coal, which is the base load power that prevents us from having blackouts and keeps our energy grid reliable.
Thank you. I strongly believe that it is well past time for us to start making it easier to build in this country, which is why my colleague, Mr. Jimmy Panetta, and I introduced the Studying NEPA's Impact on Projects Act. This common sense bipartisan bill would require reporting on several NEPA metrics, including the volume of litigation, the paperwork burden, and the time that it takes to clear the NEPA process, which we all know is oftentimes far too long. Shifting gears a bit, because of the AI revolution, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation revised its projected 10-year peak demand forecast from 40 gigawatts to nearly 80 gigawatts of electricity. That's the equivalent of 24 million households. If anything is crystal clear around here, it's that our future and future technologies will need more energy, not less. The EPA's power plant rule is a de facto ban on coal-fired power plants and prohibits more natural gas power plants from being built. Mr. Epstein, what sort of impact will this rule have on our ability to meet the nation's future energy demands, and what are the economic consequences of failing to meet this demand?
I just want to make clear that everyone needs to do everything possible not to let these rules go into effect. They are just a complete death sentence to the grid. I mean, I'm not shocked often, but I'm shocked by this. Again, the fundamentals are we already have a grid in crisis thanks to bad policy shutting down reliable power plants and then promoting more electrification. We have artificial more demand from EVs that the administration is forcing. And then, as you mentioned, we have a lot of organic, healthy demand from new uses of electricity, and yet we're shutting down our reliable coal plants, which are 1/6 of capacity, and we're passing restrictions that are going to prevent most new natural gas plants from being built. I mean, I don't know what it's saying. It's like, let's just become Lebanon or something like that. I mean, it's just unbelievable that we're not thinking about this. So, I mean, these rules are so far beyond the pale. I mean, what does it mean to just have blackouts all the time? I mean, it just means a huge portion of people die. Look what happened to Texas just a few years ago with a tiny version of these policies. So if you want to talk about existential threat, that's life without a grid.
Thank you. And briefly, Ms. Jackson, environmental justice is predicated upon the assumption that energy production has a disproportionate negative impact on minority and impoverished communities. Ms. Jackson, do you believe that environmental justice efforts, including in the IRA and other Biden administration initiatives, are actually helping the working class?
They're doing anything but that. That would be my first plan of action if I was in office, is to get rid of the environmental justice agenda, because it's doing more harm than good.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Indiana, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Chuck Edwards from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All of you, thanks for being with us this afternoon. Mr. Epstein, I'll begin with you. I represent a district in the western part of North Carolina. It's a mountainous region. And with all the calls for us to do away with fossil fuels, we have one major power plant in my district, by the way, in the mountains. Keep in mind, it's in the mountains. But with all these calls to convert from fossil fuel to solar and wind, I've done some calculating on what it would take for us to convert the one 566 megawatt power plant that we have to all solar. How many acres it would take for solar panels to generate that same amount of energy. It's in the tens of thousands of acres. That's just simply not available unless we were to carve up all of our agricultural land. When I look at windmills, which, by the way, appear to be 30 stories tall. Now, mind you, we're in the mountains. It would be very difficult to put a 30-story tall windmill in a mountain region, let alone, I think it was 2,400 acres that I calculated it would take of windmills to generate that same megawatt of power out of the one station that we have. Have you calculated into the cost anywhere the loss of residential land, farmland, and what it would take to convert into?
So your example is so I would say this is the least of the problems of solar and wind. It's a problem, and so what you see is that in certain locations it's just totally not doable, and in many countries it's totally not doable. The United States is vast, so you can imagine, like Elon Musk will say, and it's valid as far as it goes, but doesn't go very far, that, if you put a certain amount of solar panels in Utah, that could, quote, power the whole country. I mean, one problem is how do you get everything to the rest of the country? The main problem is the reliability problem. So you mentioned what it would cost to replace fossil fuels, solar and wind. We don't know because nobody's ever even attempted it. Nobody's attempted a self-sufficient solar and wind plant or set of plants in any sophisticated area around the world. And the reason it would be cost prohibitive. Just to give you one number, Elon, I like him in a lot of ways, but he said publicly, all we need is just a bunch of my mega packs and solar panels, we can power the world. I ran the numbers to back up the world for one day would be $100 to $200 trillion worth of megapacks. So $100 trillion is global GDP. These last 10 years, much like an EV. So it's just there is no such thing as replacing fossil fuels with unreliable solar and wind. The only way you can do it partially is because you have fossil fuels as a backup. So it's really important for people to know this is not a real thing. I'm not against solar and wind, but they should provide their own reliability, and that'll force them to actually make a contribution or get off the grid, either way.
Well, thank you for that. Ms. Fercott Roth, do you have any thoughts on replacing or taking usable land that is pretty scarce anyway and converting that into wind farms and solar farms?
Well, I think it should be up to the individual communities to decide on a level playing field without tax incentives. A lot of communities are fighting against offshore wind because they think it's unsightly. because I think there's a hum that comes from it. And it does take a lot of land and energy. Plus, the wind turbines kill birds. And when you have a bird killed on an oil rig, then that company has to pay a fine. Birds killed by wind turbines, no one seems to care about those birds. So I think it's a very complicated issue, and it should be up to individual states. For example, Kansas has a lot of wind, and it does very well with its wind, and other states might not.
Well, thank you. I'd like to suggest representing a district that has a housing crisis. We just don't have enough affordable land, and we're seeing a lot of our farmland used for other purposes now to displace the good use of that property to cover up with wind and solar panels just seems to be against common land use practices. Mr. Epstein, I'm running out of time, but real quick, I'd like to ask, because I believe the cleanest energy is the most readily available and convenient form, whether that's solar, nuclear, wind, geothermal, or fossil. But not everybody agrees, as you're well aware. This administration seems to be obsessed with eliminating fossil fuels in the name of climate change. In your opinion, what do you think is the most dangerous and potentially longest-lasting impact of the Harris-Biden administration's attack on fossil fuels?
Right, so it's them and it's the global movement. I mean, it's very simple. They're pushing for the rapid elimination of fossil fuels. I mentioned if they had remotely gotten their way so far, we'd already have a catastrophe. I mean, net zero by 2050 is the single most destructive idea human beings have ever come up with. And I mean that literally, and I'm very familiar with all the other acts, but taking a world of 8 billion people with no cost-effective replacement for fossil fuels and starving them of energy, there would never be anything like it. So we're not gonna do it in practice, but we're gonna do something really, really bad along the way. And with Biden-Harris in particular, it's the US will do it and others won't. So that means we cede our economic and security position. And in a dangerous world, I do not want that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield.
Thank the gentleman, and now yield 5 minutes to our colleague from New York, Mr. Tom Suozzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to apologize to the witnesses. I had another hearing up at Homeland Security, so I missed a lot of your stuff. I've been trying to read some of the stuff here quickly. I apologize for being late, Mr. Chairman. So I'm concerned about high cost of energy. I'm concerned about high gas prices. I'm glad that gas prices are going down right now, and I'm glad inflation's going down right now, and that the Fed reduced the interest rates yesterday, and that's positive things that we see happening. But we're all concerned about high energy costs that exist. And I'm also concerned about the weather. I mean, I see these crazy weather events. I'm up in New York, and I've seen these crazy flooding and extreme heat. And you remember last year when they had the forest fires up in Canada and the smoke was coming down. We had to close our windows because the forest fires were up there, were out of our control, and the smoke was coming down. And it's like, wow, what would happen if this goes on for a month or 2 months? What would we do? What if it went on for longer? What would we do? So I think most people are concerned about what's happening with the climate, and I think that most people are concerned about high energy costs. And I agree that trying to force things to happen before we've figured out a way to do it properly can force the prices to go up on things. And I'm concerned when, in my state, for example, that we're just doing it on our own. We were doing it on our own before there was like even federal subsidies to encourage it to happen. That made it even more expensive in our state, in New York. And I'm concerned about individual states trying to go it alone without a comprehensive federal policy. So if I'm somebody who's concerned about high costs, and I'm concerned about climate, what do you think we need to be doing right now to try and reduce the impacts of greenhouse gases on climate change while also trying to keep the cost down? So, Mr. Epstein, you seem most anxious to talk.
I'm very anxious. Thank you. Thank you for the great question. So I would say, I'll just make this a sidebar, but I wouldn't be as concerned as you are because—
About what?
about climate, I'm not saying to have no
Oh, no,
concern,
I'm-
but our ability to
you're not
deal
gonna
with it
persuade me not
is
to be
well, I might someday. I'll give you a copy of Fossil Future. I think I might. But okay, on this issue, if you are concerned, you have to recognize one fundamental truth, okay, which is the U.S. has very limited control over global emissions, and emissions are a global issue. So we have
No, listen, I recognize that we, in the 80s and 70s, 80s, 90s, we chased a lot of industry out of America, and it goes to other countries, and they're polluting way worse than we ever did.
So
And
what
they're
we
building
need to
coal plants, and, you know,
So our leverage point, our only leverage point is to, on this, and on your terms, is to liberate truly globally cost-competitive alternatives. I think the most promising is nuclear. It's hypothetical, you might be able to do with solar and wind if you can figure out reliability. Nobody's figured that out yet. Geothermal has some potential, but you need to move all the roadblocks out of the way for alternative forms of energy. And that requires radical NEPA reform, requires radical reform of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, something I'm working on. So I'd love to talk to you sometime or anyone else about how to do this, because what we've done to nuclear is a crime, and what New York has done to nuclear is a crime. What
Yeah,
we've done to natural
awful.
gas.
I really think that we should be building more nuclear power in America. I'm concerned, however, you know, when they try to do it in dense areas, that's a problem. I'm concerned about getting rid of nuclear waste. Where are we going to put the nuclear waste?
Right, so nuclear waste is the...
And I'm concerned about transmission lines when you build these facilities, whether it be wind or solar or nuclear, in these very far-off locations, transmitting it to where you need the power.
I think nuclear is a lot safer than you've been led to believe. Certainly what's called the waste, the used fuel, that's the safest form of waste we have. It's very small, it's very manageable, it hasn't damaged anyone, we can store it indefinitely. So nuclear, unfortunately, has been demonized even more than fossil fuels. It has the advantage of it's very dense, it's stored energy, there's a lot we can do with it, but we need to get the government out of the way. We can't, subsidizing specific American boutique energy does nothing globally.
So, you know,
And if I could add that New York State, you all have the Marcellus Shale, but you're not using it, and there's a lot of clean natural gas that could come out of that, which Pennsylvania is using right now, and you all are not. And New York State has a 70% renewable portfolio standard goal, and that's also driving up the price of energy in New York State.
yeah, I think that, you know, I just take about the end of my, we have to figure out how to balance our two systems, okay? Capitalism is the best system in the history of the world. It's created more wealth, it's created more innovation, it's lifted more people out of poverty. It's the best system, but it's based upon competition. And the better competitor you are, the better you're gonna do. If you're a bad competitor, you're not gonna do well. But we don't want people who are bad competitors to be relegated to a life of misery. So we have another system called democracy. It says all men and women are created equal. So we gotta put some protections in place. So the question the challenge for us is how to find a balance between these two systems on a knife's edge, because if we go too far, too many protections, we kill the goose that laid the golden egg. If we do no protections, we end up with people with a bunch of miserable lives. The challenge of our current environment in America is nobody finds balance. Everybody's saying, you're one of those, no, you're one of those, and we don't find that balance anymore. So we've got to work together and find some balance. To balance in this question, in this issue, there's a lot of us concerned about climate change, and there's a lot of us concerned about cost, but we got to find a balance between the two. I'm sorry for going over, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate that. Mr. Swazi, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Burkeen from Oklahoma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a statement I heard from my old boss years ago, indirectly, that whenever the government seeks to make something affordable, it makes it too expensive for everybody else. Ms. Roth, I'm looking at your chart, and your chart, and it's hard to kind of see, so I'll have to probably be no way to get a visual on it. Oklahoma does really well. That's what you just said. We come in on our price per kilowatt hour, but we're paying about 12 cents per kilowatt hour. When you look at the top of your chart, those states that are trying to go down this pathway of green energy, California's paying 32 cents per kilowatt hour. Rhode Island's paying 27 cents. Connecticut is paying 26 cents. Hawaii's paying 42 cents. And they're projected to increase their involvement in government assistance to try to make this energy much more affordable. Again, whenever the government tries to make things affordable, it makes it more expensive for everybody. I just came out of another committee where I complimented Tom Swazi from New York. He doesn't know it yet, out of Homeland. I'm going to pay him another compliment. We keep chasing each other in these committee assignments. And he just said that free markets are the best allocation of scarce resources, more or less, that capitalism works. I come to the statement It wasn't a Democrat statement. It wasn't a Republican statement. It was a French statesman who wrote a book years ago called The Law, and he said that, is it not enough that tax law should be just? Does it also have to be philanthropic? He goes on to talk about taking from the many to give to the few. That's my problem with the green energy movement. You're taking from the many to give to the few billionaires that are taking these tax credit subsidizations derived from the many, given to the few. It's repayment for political activism. They're doing these startup companies, and the taxpayers are subsidizing it. Is it not enough that tax law should be just? Does it have to be philanthropic? I think it's a great principle. It's not a Republican principle. It's not a Democrat principle. It's a solid principle written in the early 1800s by a French statesman. The Law. Look it up. Anybody that's interested. And he was saying that what America was getting great and doing well. I'm going to give you some stats I found astounding this morning. If you went to the gas pump in 2020, in September, you would have paid $2.27 for a gallon of gas. According to the Energy and Information Administration, right now you'll pay $3.75. That's a $1.50 increase. If you compare your electric bill from September 2020 to 2024 September, you'll notice you're paying $30 more a month. That's according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you compare your gas bill from September 2020 to heat your home as compared to June of 24, unfortunately not having the most recent data, just June of 2024, you'll notice you're paying approximately $25 more a month according to the Energy Information Administration. If you compare the number of jobs in the energy sector under President Trump to the number of jobs in the energy under President Biden, you'll see an 11% loss in jobs nationally, 33% loss in my home state of Oklahoma, according to the Federal Reserve. If you compare the average annual wage for workers in the oil and gas industry in 2020 to the average annual wage for those same workers in 2024, you'll notice they're making $34,000 less, according to the Texas Independent Producers Royalty Owners Association, $34,000 less. You can buy a car with that. You can do one heck of a once-in-a-lifetime vacation for that. That is the difference also between the affording the American dream and struggling. Under this administration, though, the green energy donor class has been the recipient, taking from the many to give to the few, these green credit tax credits for new cars that most people can't afford without that tax credit, skewing the free market, while working Americans have to be taxed higher through this regressive tax, Ms. Jackson, that you talked about, that the middle class is bearing the burden of. Under this administration, Americans are having to choose between groceries and health care and can I afford my electric, gas, home heating bills, air conditioning bills in the summer? Where I want to go with this. Ms. Jackson, you represent a constituency that is seen taking from the many to give to the few, their tax dollars to subsidize this. It was, we are at the expense of supposedly saving the planet, we're destroying the American middle-class family and their ability to afford goods and services. I want to let you talk about that just a little bit more in case I've inspired you even further.
Yes. What I'm seeing is the people that I represent are experiencing the lowest standard of living expenses in history. Their existence have been significantly decreased, and they're suffering because of it. There's higher energy prices, but energy prices go into everything that we have. And so they're paying more for food, more for kids' necessities, baby food. But, you said you were giving some numbers. I know people that are paying 4 times as much as they were for electric bills. So, we're talking about a few $30 here, $30 there, but these families are already stretched to capacity, and we're continuing to pile on. So they're really hurting, and it's at the expense, at the climate, at any cost. So save the people. Save the people. We're saving the climate, but we're at the expense of destroying the people.
I thank the gentlelady, thank my colleague from Oklahoma. His time's expired, and I now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Omar from Minnesota for 5 minutes. Our new ranking member, by the way.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to all the panelists for being here today. Mr. Higgins, I know you have written extensively about the Inflation Reduction Act's House hold impact and cost savings. I want to dive deeper into these numbers. According to a Treasury analysis released last month, the IRA delivered $8.4 billion in tax credits to nearly 3.5 million families in 2023. Could you talk about these home tax credits and how they are lowering costs for working families, both in short term and long term?
Yes, thank you. The number of families that are benefiting already from the Inflation Reduction Act, even though we're just 2 years in, is huge, many millions already, and that number is growing. The credits and rebates can be available at the time of sale, and they help people to afford improvements to their homes. When you're operating an electric vehicle, it costs less than half as much to drive it and to maintain it as a gasoline-powered vehicle. And these credits help you afford both either a new car or a leased car or a used car. When you buy a heat pump for your home, it can save between $60 and $800 per year on reduced fuel costs, which, depending on which fuel you're switching from. These savings make it more affordable. It's just a false choice that we have to choose between affordability and climate. And the fact is that investments increase opportunities and increase opportunities, and clean energy is the most affordable. So they reduce costs at the same time as they're creating jobs.
And if some consumers choose not to take advantage of these programs, do they still help lower energy costs for those households?
Yes, so the average household is looking to save about $2,000 a year, which is a third of their household energy costs by 2030, which is an extraordinary trajectory. And overall, by switching to clean energy, because it is so much more affordable, the households everywhere can save. So if natural gas demand domestically declines, that would lead to lower fossil fuel energy prices with ramifications for agriculture, for households that stay on fossil fuels. And the main risk there is that if the surplus is instead exported, it exposes American manufacturers and households to even higher fuel costs. And LNG exports could raise energy costs by 10%, natural gas costs.
And since my Republican colleagues want to focus on the economic and fiscal costs of energy policy, I think it's worth breaking this down. Congressional Republicans often frame such costs very narrowly, looking only at government spending or regulatory impacts, usually when it threatens the bottom line of their wealthy donors or large corporations, but this narrow view ignores the full economic picture. When we talk about economic costs, we must consider the externalities, from social to environmental impacts that are not usually accounted for. Mr. Higgins, when we begin to consider the cost of things like adverse health and climate outcomes, what would you say are the true costs associated with our existing fossil fuel industry and with policies that only expand fossil fuel infrastructure?
Fossil fuel pollution disproportionately affects families, Black and brown families, low-income families, living in low-income communities, and claims that reducing fossil fuel pollution for these households would actually amount to environmental injustice are reprehensible. And claims that raising global temperatures would actually be beneficial or easy to deal with, I think, are a denial of the consensus climate science that fossil fuel pollution threatens disastrous and irreversible consequences.
Totally agree. Additionally, when we discuss fiscal costs, we need to look at a bigger picture beyond initial federal expenditures. We should be evaluating the long-term effects of public investments, including long-standing hidden tax breaks. This is why I introduced the End Polluter Welfare Act with Senator Sanders. This bill will end wasteful subsidies that are supporting big oil and that have long been a drain on our budget. Mr. Higgins, can you explain how this bill, combined with the investments of the IRA, would help us move towards a sustainable energy future that benefits all Americans, not just the wealthy oil and gas executives?
Switching to clean energy helps to reduce the volatility of fossil fuel prices. It prevents when global prices increase, which used to be, it means that domestic prices increase. It used to be that was unique to gasoline. It's now also natural gas because of our export capacity. And although the price that these companies can charge is increased, the people who pay the bill are American consumers.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady and now yield 5 minutes to my friend from Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin my questions, I have two unanimous consent requests. One, to insert into the record a study from the American Gas Association on the critical importance of oil and natural gas to the U.S. healthcare sector. And a second unanimous consent request to submit a study from the American Gas Association on the importance of natural gas to the United States pharmaceutical industry.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And forgive me if I don't pronounce your name correctly, but Mr. Fercott Roth, and I apologize also for being late. We always have multiple things going on here. I was chairing a Rules Committee hearing on the future rules in Congress. I took a beating from the representative of the Budget Committee over the 302B allocations. So now I'm moving on from that. But during the Trump administration, from an energy policy standpoint, things were much better in my estimation. Worldwide stability was increased, and of course, prices for everyone across the spectrum, high and low income, prices were lower. So why would the Biden administration and the Harris administration move away from Trump's energy policies if they were working so well?
I think that there is an ideological commitment to wind and solar, and the view that it lowers prices just is not true, as can be seen from this chart where it shows that the biggest users of wind and solar have the highest electricity prices. Moreover, if we produce more clean natural gas, we can export it to our allies, we can have more geopolitical power in the world, we can reduce our dependence on China.
Sure,
If we produce more critical minerals, again, we can reduce our dependence on China.
We're exporting freedom. And in your list, and this is intriguing, of course, Washington State has, you've recorded there, 100% renewable fuel portfolio.
Yeah, that's because it's blessed with hydropower.
Hydropower.
So hydropower is relatively inexpensive, and geographically, Washington State and also Oregon have a lot of hydropower.
But our former colleague, now Governor Inslee, is doing his best to dismantle the dams in Washington State. So I guess he's anxious to push himself up higher on that list with higher energy costs for his constituents as he does away with hydropower. Of course, hydropower also has another limitation. We do experience droughts sometime in various places in this country, and hydropower, for example, I was in Norway several years ago, and they were experiencing a significant drought, which they were having to import natural gas in order to provide energy for their citizens. Because, as Mr. Epstein so correctly pointed out, the existential threat is when there's no energy to put on the grid. And we saw that in Texas, and I've been a student of irony for some time. In December of 2019, front page of the Net Record Chronicle, front page story, the dismantling, not just we're not going to use a coal plant anymore in South Texas. They actually physically dismantled it. They bulldozed it. It's never going to be used again. And then in February of 2021, we had that cold snap where hundreds of people died because there was no energy from that coal plant to put on the grid when they really needed it. So that is the existential threat. You flip the switch and nothing happens.
Yeah, I would love to comment on that. I mean, I was one of the people on the record before Winter Storm Uri and that disaster happened saying Texas's reserve margin is dangerously low. I mean, the problem is people equate the so-called capacity of unreliable electricity with the capacity of reliable electricity. But reliable electricity or dispatchable electricity, that means you can have it when you need it in the quantity you need it. Unreliable electricity, you don't know when. And what happened during Winter Storm Uri was solar and wind, when needed most, went out to lunch. At 1%, at one point, they were less than 1% of theoretical capacity, which is why it should be called fantasy, not capacity. And relying on that is very dangerous.
And it was dangerous. And then, Mr. Higgins, I came in just as you were concluding your exchange with Mr. Lopez, and you differed on the effect of EVs and the number of EVs. And I will just share with you something I do not understand. I've been a student and consumer of hybrid technology since I first served on the science committee many, many years ago and heard about what Toyota was doing with the hybrid vehicle. I frankly do not understand why the almost religious push to EVs. I get it. They're great toys for rich people. We subsidize them. We take money from some people and give it to others. But why not the same focus on hybrid technology, which would deliver much more capacity to a larger number of people, and it would not take the enormous battery capacity that an EV has to have?
I mean, the only thing that you can conclude is they want to take away private car ownership from the vast majority of people in this country. Because that's how you create wealth.
So plug-in hybrids are eligible for some of the same tax credits that full electric vehicles are. And non-plug-in hybrids that I think you might be referring to also benefit from the EPA's pollution standards because they have lower pollution than the average vehicle.
Yeah, but the push from the federal government was to go to all EVs. And honestly, we could have done much better for the country if we hadn't tried to make people buy things they didn't want and made things that were useful to people available and the consumer would have chosen, as I have done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
I thank the good doctor, and now bringing us home,
Solve all of our energy problems.
our vice chair of the conference, our fearless leader from Utah, Mr. Blakemore, for 5 minutes, and we got another colleague who will also share his thoughts and have questions, but we'll go with you first, Mr. Moore. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. This is one of those hearings, as you listen to the debate back and forth, trying to solve multiple issues regarding energy. We're at a point where we have to keep things very simple. Let's keep it basic here. What do we know? I think it goes back to a random text message thread that I have with some of my college buddies in 2020 when, as President Biden was taking over in the White House, I remember there being a back and forth, and then one of the guys said to the other, well, let's just see what gas prices are in this administration versus what they were in the last administration. And at some point, we have to just keep things as simple as possible. And I look at this issue as I trust American technology, I trust American ingenuity, I trust American workforce, I trust American industry far more than I trust anybody else in the entire world. And if we can't fundamentally agree on that, then why even get to the next point what I'm going to make is we as Americans have to have base load power energy. Those are the two simple truths. That if we cede the energy creation to other nations, where we've proven that we could become dominant, we could have, we could own this and be a net exporter. If we cede that to other nations, they will not do it with the appropriate labor and environmental standards that I trust our industries to be able to do. That's what I've seen from the Biden and Harris administration. Since they took office, energy prices have soared for everyday Americans. From day one of this administration, they put the interests of far-left climate activists over the needs of American families. But equally important than the pocketbooks of every single American family is our national security. They make it more difficult. They're putting these burdensome regulations, and they make it almost impossible to utilize domestic resources that made us energy independent during the previous Trump administration. Ms. Fercott-Roth, do you believe developing our critical mineral resources and cultivating a strong energy sector is a matter of national security? Can you expound on the national security concerns that we have when it comes to the Biden administration's energy policy? So to hit on that, I'd also like to point out, since my colleague from Oklahoma was really happy with his 46th spot, notice that Utah's always just a little bit better than everywhere else we approach. I actually take a lot of pride in Utah being able to keep energy affordable, and we're building into our system, if we could just get permitting reform under control, we're actually building in tons of renewable technology to help diversify our energy grid. right? That's the reality of what's happening, and we're keeping energy prices as low as pretty much every other state. But we're also doing it by investing in. Now, if you just let us do some transmission lines by reforming NEPA, and if the left would stop making it impossible to reform permitting, maybe we could actually do more good, clean technology. But that's maybe for another hearing.
Right, well, I think it's not only is the Biden administration mandating the electric vehicles and reducing the capacity of the power grid, it's also not allowing American companies to mine the critical minerals that are needed to make the EVs. And as a result, we're dependent on China, which is vacuuming up which is sending out EVs and vacuuming up critical minerals all over the world with forced labor, buying mines in Africa, and that kind of thing. It all comes down to also jobs in the United States. We've heard a lot today about the jobs created by the Inflation Reduction Act. We haven't heard anything about the layoffs at Stellantis, where plants are closing, and also at Ford, where plants are closing for the internal combustion engine vehicles because they're not permitted to make them anymore. And these jobs are going overseas to China. And I think it's noteworthy that this is the first time the Teamsters has not endorsed any candidate, particularly the Democratic administration. They are not coming out for Vice President Harris because of the loss of jobs, and that's so important to the United States.
Excellent. Thank you for pointing that out. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit this article from the author by our witness, Ms. Roth, titled Beijing Biden's Energy Policies Will Lose the New Cold War into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Also, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit an article from the American Energy Alliance into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, and my time is up.
I
Yield
thank
back.
the gentleman from the great state of Utah. And we're going to close it out here with Mr. Ralph Norman from the Palmetto State for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of you for taking the time to come. You know, what's happened during the last 4 years is untenable. The Biden administration has completely torn the economy out of a frame that we've never seen before. And this issue, this business of stopping the production of oil and natural gas and buying it from the OPEC countries that are our enemies, putting money in the pocket of our enemies, is criminal. And if you list everything else, to the border, to the out-of-control crime, this country doesn't deserve that. It's going to take a lot to reverse the damage that has been done. Ms. Fercott Roth, would you, you mentioned that Biden has made a cornerstone of this administration to lock up 30% of the federal lands. Why is this such a dangerous idea that he's doing this?
Because it takes away people's property, it takes away the ability to use the resources on that, including oil and natural gas. It's as though someone in Alaska said to me, you cannot have your vegetable garden in your backyard. And that hurts the United States. It increases global emissions because we cannot produce clean natural gas and export it to our allies where they can use it to replace coal.
Well, that, as well as many other things, are just totally, to be honest, it's un-American, and it's crippling this country. Mr. Epstein, I see your book. I've heard great things about it. I need to get one before I leave.
I have one for any representative who's interested.
Well, you have mentioned that that the administration's pause on liquefied LNG exports is deadly. Can you explain why it is deadly?
I mean, natural gas is, like all forms of energy, is life-giving, but natural gas in particular is crucial to food. Right? We use natural gas as the basis for modern fertilizer. We have no near-term replacement for natural gas just for fertilizer. And so you're talking about making everyone's food more expensive, and you're talking about depriving people of a clean, reliable source of energy around the world. I mean, natural gas, we should have talked about more today. This is the huge opportunity cost of the current administration and past administrations. We could be radically increasing our natural gas capacity, if not for some domestic bans like in New York, but mainly pipeline capacity. We can't build pipelines, so all of our gas is locked away in certain places. If we could build pipelines, we could have it more around the country, and we could have it more around the world. And this is I mentioned this in my testimony, the opportunity cost of not having energy freedom and instead replacing it with government-dictated green energy. People have no idea how prosperous we could be, and they have no idea how poor we will be if we keep going in this direction.
I wish all of you could have heard the testimony of the governor of Alaska, talking about the
He's great.
damage that they are doing to Alaska. That's a source of income. They're putting them out of business. And the look on his face during the testimony is unconscionable that they're continuing to do this. So it's not just here in America. You mentioned that the Biden, and I call it the border czars, EPA's power plant rule destroy our U.S. electrical grid. Given that we've already in the midst of an electricity reliability crisis, what else can we do of these last 2 months of hopefully the end of this?
What can Congress do?
What would you urge us to do
Yeah,
specifically?
I would urge, so the most immediate thing is do whatever you can to pause the shutdown of reliable power plants, not just the EPA rule, which is just mass destruction, but all the other rules too. So we could document all the different things, but basically, we should not be shutting down any reliable power plants right now because it is a threat to the health and safety of Americans. EPA is supposed to protect our health. You cannot have health with a reliable grid, so they're doing the exact opposite. So, I've talked to some people about legislation to do that, but I think, we should put a pause on these shutdowns.
Well, the regulations that they've imposed on companies, and not just gas and oil, I'm in the real estate business. And as I've told, the people realize that so goes the real estate market, mainly housing, so goes the economy. There are no battery-operated dump trucks that deliver concrete. There are no battery-operated dump trucks that deliver our food. It's gas and oil. So I just want to thank you. I'm out of time, but we're going to do what we can in the remainder of this term to hopefully reverse some regulations, and the next administration will make a change.
I'm happy to help any way I can.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank our witnesses for your time and contributions, and this was a great hearing, and we now will close out, but let me advise that members may still submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit questions for the record may do so within the next 7 days. And with that, the committee stands adjourned.